Good evening all and welcome. I'd like to just thank everyone for subscribing and pressing the bell icon and keeping those notifications on. It genuinely feels like YouTube is trying to turn it off for a bunch of people, so for everyone who has returned and keeps watching, thank you. It really means the world to me. So for tonight's compilation, this particular vintage of stories is from about 1.5 to 2 years ago, so I really hope you enjoy the mix. But for now it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I grew up in Yuki, northern New South Wales. We lived in the bush in an area dotted with abandoned homes and cottages. Some of these were completely isolated and cut off from any roads. I loved taking my dogs for bushwalks. Sometimes we would find these houses and usually give them a wide berth, as they weren't always unoccupied and sometimes inhabited by unsavory types. This is a true story. I have tried to be as true in telling it as memory serves. So not far from my childhood home, there is an empty house. It sits on a sea of green ferns and tall grasses, with a veranda that encircles 3 of its hexagonal walls, clad in earthy brown timbers. It is an artificial island surrounded by an encroaching regiment of native gun and grasping lantana. Access to civilization was cut off years ago when the old wooden bridge that connected the property to the outside world surrendered to the inexorable marching of time and decay. A faded 64 XM Falcon sits in the garage under a mouldy green tarp, hastily tossed across the rusted bonnet. The house comes with all the trappings of occupancy, but its owners have long since vanished. A suffocating silence chastises intrusion, and no one ever goes there. It was Amy who introduced me to the empty house where no one goes. I had been wasting the long summer mining for coal on RuneScape. I had spent hours slumped in that office chair, eyes glued to the screen, absently clicking the new cold spawn. We were in the opening days of the new year of 2007 and had just upgraded from dial-up to broadband. I was finally allowed a MySpace account as I was starting high school in a few short weeks. By that point of the holidays, I'd stomached all of the video games I could handle, and being the youngest in the family meant that I should relish the opportunity to be included by my older sister and her friends. She'd burst into the office full of her usual vivacity and snapping me out of my reverie. "Hey Rob, me and Aaron are going for a walk, you want to come?" I quickly agreed. A little adventure would definitely break up the tedium. We followed our dusty dirt road as it wound its way down the western shoulder of heavily forested hills. A few people lived nearby, and it would have been quiet, if not for the rather raucous buzzing that belonged to the army of cicadas that set the summer air vibrating. Zeta and Tanner led the way, their tails wagging, their noses low to the ground. They'd stop every so often, turning and waiting to make sure we weren't falling behind. 1 red and 1 blue. Cattle dogs which loved nothing more than the promise of adventure. The air grew cooler as we descended towards the gully floor. Amy and Aaron chatted loudly, carefree and boisterous. Suddenly, the sound of something crashing through dry undergrowth interrupted the apparent peace. Birds erupted from their perches above us, and we stopped in our tracks. The dogs never missed a beat, crashing madly down the hillside, leaping over fallen logs and racing out of sight. There was the sound of Tana yipping excitedly for a moment, then silence. The silence stretched for a moment before I saw a flash of red and blue, as the dogs raced across a stretch of open grass far below. "It looks like there's a paddock down there. They may be after horses," I said, trying to sound casual. Many of the people who lived on the property surrounding our home were of the reclusive, unsavory breed. They would not welcome trespassing dogs or children on their property, and the idea of a confrontation left us feeling uneasy. We quickly began negotiating a way down in the direction our furry friends had vanished. It wasn't before long we'd made our own very loud way down the slope. The dogs suddenly appeared ahead, looking excited but sheepish, the chase apparently over. "There they are," Aaron exclaimed. "Bad dogs," I growled, doing my best prepubescent attempt at a deep and threatening voice. Zita joined us, panting slightly, but otherwise nonchalant in the face of my rebuke. I ruffled her ears and looked ahead. A couple of chestnut-coated mares, cloistered and presently ignoring us, stood at the end of a small paddock, split by a small stream. On the other side of the stream, a mob of wallabies peered warily from the shadows cast by tall trees bordering the enclosure. The sound of water bubbling over rocks could be heard in their direction. As one, the wallabies turned and bounded into the gloom, gone as quickly as they had appeared. "I've never been down here," said Amy. "Let's go and see what's down that creek." After several minutes, we passed into the shadows of the trees. It was quieter here, the earlier cacophony of cicadas forgotten. The creek tumbled its noisy way down a rock face and burbled its way into a deep pool before winding onwards into the relative darkness of the forest. Up ahead, through the heavy branches of camphor laurel trees, the dark walls of a house were suddenly visible. Curious, we made our way upwards, leaving the shelter of the trees and getting a clearer view of the enigmatic building. The house was double-storied with a large veranda. It was a beautiful structure, though it was immediately clear that it was unoccupied. The grass was waist-height, spotted with creeping lumps of lantana. Ferns were everywhere, clinging to the shadows of the few saplings that dared to leave the protective fringe that surrounded the clearing. A prickle teased the back of my neck and I shivered. A small voice inside urged me to turn around and go home, but our inquisitive nature won us over, and we ventured forwards. We were suddenly subdued, yet could not tell why. The air felt thick, heavy, and hot. We passed on tiptoes under the leeward side of the wooden house and passed under its balcony, where the door frame yawned open. The door hung uselessly off broken hinges. Within, darkness reigned. We halted upon the threshold, but advanced no further. Nobody said a word. Nobody dared to, despite our apparent isolation. An old sink, filled with cobwebs and grime, stood on one side of a walkway parallel to a set of cupboards with wooden slatted doors. They hung open, revealing layers of dust, webs, and a dead rat, as well as a small collection of tin containers. A narrow set of stairs wound its way to the upper level at the end of a passageway littered with debris. The mood was heavy, stifling, and uncomfortable. I felt an overwhelming sense that I needed to get out of there. We were uninvited guests, poised upon a threshold of animosity, and the promise of retribution seemed almost tangible. Malevolent eyes watched quietly from every hidden corner. "There's a garage over there." Erin's quiet voice broke the silence, falling flat and unwelcome as the rest of us. We gingerly made our way through the long grass towards the old garage, our necks rubber banding, on constant watch for snakes or other more sinister denizens of the empty house. An old rope swing hung from the tired limbs of a gnarled tree, swaying listlessly in an imperceptible breeze. A car was parked inside the garage, its original green-blue coat faded almost beyond recall. A Rego sticker clung tenaciously to the corner of the windshield. 8 years expired. We edged past it, skirting an assortment of old bric-a-brac typical to a carport, and ducked under a roller door still half open. I breathed an involuntary exclamation. The entire room housed rows of strange, monochrome machinery. Dials and buttons adorned their faces, dozens of electrical cords bound them together. Dust blanketed everything. "What is it?" Amy questioned. "It looks like some sort of recording and broadcasting equipment." The certainty in my voice surprised me. It's very old, 30 years or more if I had to guess at the time. I think I must have seen something in a magazine once. "Who owns all this stuff?" Aaron whispered in a small voice. "And why did they leave?" His question was left unanswered. A house, a car, ancient, yet no doubt expensive radio equipment. All of it left without warning or any sign of taking the time to secure it. Nothing was locked or covered up. If it was the original inhabitants, he had simply vanished. We spent some minutes wandering up and down the aisles, touching nothing, fearing that the old machines would burst back into life at any moment. I caught myself holding my breath and turned to face the others. "Let's see if we can see anything inside the house from the veranda." We went back outside, feeling no less suffocated. A wide set of steps led up to the deck. The wood was old, yet still sturdy. The roof had remained intact and kept its timbers dry. We stopped to peer through the kitchen window. The second level of the house was mostly open-planned, with a generously sized kitchen and living room. I half expected to see the table set up for dinner. All sense of the mundane ended there. Splintered timber covered every surface. Even the floor hadn't been spared. I could see the first floor below through the gaping wooden wounds. The hair on my arms was standing on the end of the dull thrumming of my heart as it roared in my ears. It looked like an axe-wielding madman had torn the place apart. "There's a phone on the counter," whispered Amy. It was a landline-style Aristel phone, typical of the late 90s. An off-white with grey rectangular buttons. Its tightly wound, curly cord was plugged into the wall. On impulse, I slid open the unlocked window and snatched the phone from the cradle and raised my ear. There was a dial tone, I mouthed, scarcely believing it. Tentatively, I dialed the 8 digits home. "Is it ringing?" Amy asked. A bead of sweat ran down her pale face, her white knuckles visible on the windowsill. I nodded, waiting with bated breath. "No answer," I declared, putting the phone back on the hook. "Let's go in," when suddenly there was a ring. No one said anything. No one breathed so much. My eyes darted from Amy to Aaron and then back to the phone. It never occurred to me to answer. I wasn't waiting to find out who was on the other end. Amy and Aaron were already halfway down the stairs, tripping over the dogs in a hurry to get out. I raced after them, my heart hammering in my throat, as an explosion of adrenaline carried me away from the malevolent ruin on frenzied wings. We didn't stop running until we got home. Winded, sweat-streaked, and dirty, we collapsed onto the couch. "Hello, you three," Aaron screamed in terror, but it was only my mum standing in the doorway and looking around rather amused. The stories spilled out of us, one interrupting another, in the rush to recount the morning's events. And then, "I tried to call you but you didn't answer. And then it rang, Mum, it rang." Mum laughed. "Well, that was very strange. But I know who called you back. The phone rang 20 minutes ago. I didn't recognize the number, so I hit redial, but then no one answered." I sighed with relief. My imagination momentarily assured. "But if you weren't able to use the phone?" Mum said that meant the phone line is still connected, which also means someone's paying the phone bill. If someone comes home and checks their message banks, they could return my call. Images of our own home, with axe-riven walls torn apart by an eldritch nightmare, flashed through my mind. My mouth went dry. What if they hit redial? "You left a message?" Thankfully, there was never a return call or a visitor as a result of our trip. I went back in 2020, and the house showed signs of previous inhabitants, likely squatters, with wrappers of food that had expired in 2016. The phone was now gone, but it left me with more questions than answers. My father was a handsome, young 20-something living in a half-sketchy, half-artsy area in Westport with my mother. They were newlyweds expecting their first child, my older brother, within a month. This was the mid-1980s. At the time, my father was into the whole Robert Smith kind of look, dark long hair and piercings, and kind of had a sensitive feminine look going on. He had been mistaken as a gay before because of his look. Not to stereotype my own people, but you know what I mean here. This is important in a bit. My parents had been shopping around Westport on a street full of little boutique-style shops. My mother stepped into a shop to look around, and my father waited outside smoking a cigarette. He said a man came out of an adjacent store and struck up a conversation with him. The man was polite and friendly, but as the conversation continued, he became increasingly personal with his line of questions. Where do you live? Do you want to come over, etc.? My father was young and dumb, and too trusting, having grown up in a small Kansas town and being newly transplanted to this large city. But still, this man began to strike my dad as odd. Just as it was getting weird, my mother came out the store, came up behind my father and looped her arm through his. Like I said, my mother was heavily pregnant at this point, and as soon as the man saw my mother do that, he stopped what he was saying mid-sentence, turned around, and walked back into the adjacent store without another word. They both thought it was odd, but frankly my dad was glad to be away from the man. They continued shopping and went home. That man ended up being the Kansas City Butcher, or Robert Berdella, an active serial killer in the Kansas City/Westport area. His MO was to lure gay men into his home, sexually assault them, torture them, and then finish the job. He was caught only a few weeks after his encounter with my father when a victim escaped his home, fleeing down the street in only a dog collar. My father highly suspects that Bob Berdella was scoping him out as a potential victim, and upon seeing my pregnant mother, realized he wasn't gay. Oh, and the shop he came out of? That was his shop, Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, an oddity shop that displayed the skull of one of his victims in the window. This took place in February of 1988, when I was only 8 years old. I'm now approaching my mid-40s. I still have massive anxiety when I think back to that night. For context, I am a male, and have always been the shortest person in my class with a smaller body frame. At the time of this story, I was living with my mum, my stepdad, and older sister, 3 years my senior. Because my parents were extremely poor, we found ourselves moving around quite a bit. At the time this story took place, we were renting a run-down duplex in Utah. I'm fairly confident this took place on a Wednesday evening, as that was the weekday my family would gather around the television and watch America's Most Wanted. After the TV show had ended at around 9 p.m, we said our goodnights and headed off to our own bedrooms. It was a school night, so I often went to bed around 9. Our duplex had 3 bedrooms, 2 on the main floor and 1 in the basement. My room was the one on the main floor, down the hall from the living room, where my mum and stepdad's bedroom were adjacent to mine at the end of the hallway. My older sister had her room in the basement. At that age, I was fearful of the dark, so would sleep with the bedroom light on so that I could see properly. But because my parents never paid their electricity bills, sometimes there was an issue with this. We also had a false sense of security living in a small Utah town, and as a result, never locked our front door. However, my mum and her husband always had a lock on their bedroom door and made sure to lock it every night, so we kids wouldn't come in unexpectedly. I remember drifting off to sleep shortly after laying down. It must have been around 1 a.m. when I was abruptly awoken from a peculiar noise in my room. As I sat up in bed responding to the noise, I was horrified to see two grown men sporting biker beards and easily towering 6 feet tall standing in my bedroom doorway. I was able to see every detail of these men because my light had been left on. The men standing in the doorway were blocking me in my room, so I was not going to be able to run past them. They both had the most evil stare, looking directly into my eyes, the likes of which I'd never seen. I was petrified. I didn't know why I did this, but in a moment of complete shock I jumped up onto my bed. But only then did it dawn on me that my little body was not going to be able to get past them. My parents' room was directly towards their backs, and my first instinct was to run into their room. Looking back now, I realize it would have done no good, since they slept securely and comfortably behind their locked bedroom door while this was taking place. Once my body motions caught up with my thought process, I instead ran to the corner of my room and crouched down. All the meanwhile, the three of us are awkwardly staring at each other. I tried to let out a scream to call for my parents, but this would be the only time in my life where I was paralyzed with fear. My vain attempts to scream mounted into silent desperation. I didn't know what these people wanted, and I could only imagine the worst. One of the men pushed his index finger to his lips in order to signal me to remain quiet. As I trembled with fear, the second man reached out to his pocket and pulled out a 6-inch blade. My room is fairly small, and they're both standing within 4 feet of me. He makes sure to swivel the knife in the air and make a point that he's not afraid to gut me like a fish. I nearly piss in my pajamas. Another attempt to scream yields nothing. Shortly after, they close my bedroom door on me, and I am left alone. Instinctively, I thought they were robbing our house, but now that they were exposed and had threatened me, surely they'd leave, right? Boy, was I wrong. I waited for a few minutes. Do I open my door and try to pound on my parents' bedroom door? Are they waiting for me behind the closed door? Who knew? After a few minutes, I gathered what little courage I could and decided to crawl back into bed and place the sheets over my entire body and wait it out. Were they planning on killing my family? I asked myself, did they leave yet? What do they want? My anxiety grew as the thoughts continued to race through my mind. As I lay there intently listening for any sounds, I could hear them moving about the house and opening and closing various kitchen drawers. The walls were paper thin in that cheap duplex, so every move was easily heard. Next, I hear them make their way down the stairs to the basement where my sister is sleeping. As I'm listening to every frightening sound, I hope with all my might that my stepdad would wake up. He was a fairly large man, and these creeps weren't exactly being quiet. This goes on for nearly an hour. I'm laying in bed, petrified, listening to their every move. To my horror, my entire family is sleeping through the ordeal. After some time, I hear the front door shut, and the early winter sun is rising. My stepdad is a factory worker and usually woke up at 5 a.m. I couldn't wait to hear my parents unlock their bedroom door. As soon as I heard their alarm, I left my room. I was hysterical while trying to explain what just happened. Next, my sister woke up. I was desperate. I wanted her to tell me about her night in the basement. My parents tried their best to calm me down, tears running down my face. I had been traumatized. To my disbelief, my parents chalked it up to a bad dream. In fact, I was told this wasn't possible, because if anything like this were to have happened, surely they'd wake up. My sister saw the desperation in my eyes and knew this was serious. Her and I went through our entire house to look for items that may have been stolen. We came across her dresser drawer left half open and many personal items out of place. This was enough evidence for her to become as frightened. But because nothing was missing from our house, my parents didn't bother calling the police. I was made to go to school as though the ordeal had never happened. Fast forward 2 weeks. We're watching TV and an update comes about a criminal being captured that was featured in Most Wanted. My heart sank when I recognized the mugshot on TV as one of the men in my room. Of course, disclosing this to my parents only made them believe me less. To this day, I still hold some sort of resentment towards them. While they slept peacefully behind a locked bedroom door, I was being victimized. Needless to say, I never sleep without locking my doors. The following is a true story that happened in the early 1990s when I was about 14 and lived with my parents. When I was about 13, my dad worked for a government contractor, and his work moved us from our hometown to another location that was about 200 miles away. To me, it seemed like out in the middle of nowhere. We moved over on my 9th grade year, but my dad moved first to find a place for us to live while our old house sold. We ended up staying in a rental for a short period of time to give my parents enough time to find the right house. After a few months went by, my parents finally found a house. From where we lived before, my hometown was a suburb and super expensive at the time. But where we moved to, the land and homes were a lot cheaper, so my parents took advantage of that and bought a huge home. We went from a single-story 3-bedroom 1-bath house to a 5-bedroom 3-bath 2-story house. I didn't get to see the house before my parents put the offer, as they went home shopping while I was at my new school. I remember when they drove by for the first time to show us the new house, and it looked like a mansion compared to our old house. Although I missed all my friends and my old neighborhood, this house from the outside looked so cool. It was in the oldest part of the city, as there was a lot of new constructions going up all around, but my parents apparently got a really great deal on the home. Once we went inside, I knew why. It was the evening when my parents got the keys to the new house, so by the time we met the realtor and drove over to the new house, it was dark outside, which made for the more creepy setting. When we walked in, it was like a time capsule. Everything looked like it had been frozen in the 1960s. It also had a funny old smell, like the place had been vacant for years. Much later, I found out that in fact the place had been sitting vacant for nearly 8 years, until we purchased it. Even before that, it was odd that the previous owners or tenants never updated a thing in the house. For example, there was shag carpet everywhere. In some rooms, it was avocado green, and in others, like burnt orange. All the appliances were from the 60s, and the paint in the rooms were all strange colors. It looked like it was a crash pad for hippies. My dad was very handy, so immediately they got working on renovating the house, having extended members of our family in different fields, like flooring, painting, and carpentry. My dad called in a lot of family to help. Eventually, the house completely renovated and we moved in. Now, I always felt uneasy in certain parts of the house. I couldn't ever explain it, but things like shadows, lights turning off and on, even my sister's hairdryer turning on at 2 a.m. one time. The thing that happened the most were footsteps. I would hear footsteps coming up the stairs at night when everything was quiet. Fast forward a year after we move in, I was the first to notice something odd in the house. This started when I asked my parents to move to an upstairs room, because it was bigger and had a nice walk-in closet, so they agreed. I started thinking about how the house was laid out upstairs. You could see there was a great open room that was the majority of the upstairs, and we used it as a family room. At the end was a hallway that went to 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, but the layout didn't make sense, as there was a void behind the other bedroom that was adjacent to mine and the bathroom. There was almost enough room for another bedroom, but that space went out over our garage. So one day I drew our house like a diagram and couldn't figure out why there was such a big void. I asked my dad and he shrugged it off. So one day I went outside to that side of the house and noticed something odd. There was once a window there. It was covered up by some big vent-looking thing with a sloppy patch of stucco At this point I was super curious and studied the layout again, and noticed that the wall on the other side of the bathroom had a patch of drywall in the shape of a doorway. It was right there. There was another room. Why did someone close it off? Obviously, my dad would have killed me if I broke open the drywall. So I had an idea and I wasn't sure if it would work. But one day when my parents were visiting my aunt and uncles, I opted to stay home alone. I knew they'd be gone for hours because of the distance. I figured out that if I went up into the attic crawl space above the garage and broke through the drywall there, my dad might not notice that. I did that, as I doubt he ever went up there. I grabbed some tools and began cutting through the drywall and eventually made a big enough opening to crawl between the studs. I was right. I entered another room of our house. I was half excited, half terrified. I was excited that I was right, but after looking around the room, it was obvious that it was a bedroom at one time. The walls were an old pink color, and the carpet had been pulled up so there was no carpet or padding, just the strips that the tracks of carpet went around the walls. I could see why they closed off the doorway. There were no doors to the closet in that room either. It looked like at one time posters were on the walls, but had been ripped off, and the only other thing I found in there was cigarette butts and old beer cans with the pull tab type that had been in the early 70s and 80s. I saw from the outside the window was removed and some metal vent was nailed in place to cover the opening. I only had a cheap flashlight with me, and even though it was during the day, the room seemed very dark inside. I started feeling really creeped out being inside it, and the smell was very old and musty. I got out of there and tried to make an excuse for going up the crawl space, so I started moving boxes of junk up there so I could tell my parents I was cleaning the garage and found it. When my parents got home, I made up a story that I was putting boxes and noticed a hole, and made the hole bigger to see what I found in the room. They didn't get mad, but almost disappointed that I stumbled on a secret. They eventually came clean that the realtor told them about the room, so I was like, hey, let's open it and make this a 6-bedroom house. My dad said no and to just leave it alone. Eventually time passed, and on occasion I would take friends up there to see the mystery room. After the opening, things in the house got even creepier. Like the footsteps going upstairs and walking upstairs would be louder. There were shadows that you would see in the dark, and one time a family friend screamed because she saw a woman in the mirror and she was walking up the stairs and thought it was my mum, but when she turned it went away. Another time a friend was sleeping over in the other room, and he ran outside in the middle of the night so scared that he went out of the house in his boxers and said something kept whispering in his ear. When I was 16, I happened to talk to an older neighbor, and he mentioned that he was one of the original owners in that neighborhood, and I asked him about my house, and he mentioned something that the son used to live there and went back to prison in the early 70s. He wouldn't go into details, but just said it was really sad and don't let drugs ruin your life. I looked up old newspapers and stuff in the library and only found an article about a teen who killed a family member and attempted to kill his parents before he was arrested. My family moved out shortly after I turned 17, and I never went back to that house again. This story happened 3 years ago. I had just come back from a vacation outside of my city, and my bus dropped me off at the station at around 1:30 a.m. I got to the main road and started looking for a cab to head home, but there was no cab or person in sight. I was standing there for a good 5 to 8 minutes looking at both sides of the road, trying to find down a cab, but was unsuccessful. When out of nowhere, to my left, I saw a girl in a white sari, which is a traditional dress for women of my country. She had not been there a moment before, and she was standing around 50 feet away underneath a lamppost. The fact that I had not seen her just moments before were rather ominous, but I told myself that in looking for a cab, I must have simply not noticed her. But my heart immediately started pounding when I looked the other way to look again for a cab and turned back the other way, to hear her saying something to me, just feet from me now. She had made it to me in record time and in near silence. My heart was nearly pounding out of my chest in fear when she said, "Can you do me a favor?" I was shaking at this point. I took 2 steps back. It was almost 2 a.m., and this girl in a white sari just sort of materialized to me. She said that she needed to get home, that it was rather late, but would like someone to accompany her, and asked if I could do her this favor. It wasn't far from here. Just for context, at this hour, it's very uncommon to see women out alone at night, simply because it can be quite a dangerous place for a woman by herself at this hour. Knowing this, despite being afraid, I walked with her, fearing for her safety if I didn't. We walked. I didn't want to talk or make eye contact. I didn't even ask her where she was going. I just followed her, walking next to her but keeping a distance. She didn't say a word the entire time we traveled, which was eerie. After walking for maybe 15 minutes, we reached a steel gate. She made a happy face and said that she lived not too far from here and thanked me. She turned back around and started walking. I thought my job was done and began walking in the opposite direction to try and look for my cab again. But curiosity panged me in the chest, and I wanted to know which direction she was traveling in specifically from here. As I turned my head around, mere seconds after her departure, I looked to see no one there. I looked at the steel gate and couldn't see her past the distance, which would be unlikely given the few seconds that had passed since me seeing her last. When I took a closer look at the gate, I noticed there was a chain and padlock around it, so there's no way she could have unlocked it, locked it again and gone through in that minimal amount of time. That's when I looked up and saw the sign over the gate, and it said it was a cemetery. Then I started running. I saw a mosque in the distance, and thinking that would be a safe haven, I ran towards it, opened the doors, and fell to the floor. The imam or priest came to greet me with a baton, thinking I was the thief. When he saw me on the floor, he spoke to me and asked what happened, and I explained everything to him. He understood and told me the following story. 8 years ago, a girl was sexually assaulted and her life taken. People found her limp body underneath the lamppost. The same lamppost I had seen her at earlier. Her face was messed up. No one could identify her and no one came to claim the body. No complaint was filed to the police, and the people responsible still roam free. Since no one claimed the body, the locals buried her in the cemetery. Since then, a lot of people, especially young guys, have had interactions with her. Some hostile, some peaceful. I'm glad that mine was otherwise, and I don't think I'll be forgetting in a hurry my interaction with the late-night girl. I'm from a small town in Iowa with around 7,000 people. When you grow up in a small town, you become really resourceful at finding fun things to do. You make the most of fun while you're having it. Urban legends are plentiful and always fun to hear. I don't live far from our capital city, and as I got older I started venturing into the city. I made a lot of friends and they loved hearing the stories of me growing up in such a small town and the fun things we did. They would beg me to take them to a cemetery about 40 minutes from our house. It's a place that I'd only been to a handful of times. I admit that in the daytime it's very innocuous. I know the area somewhat well, as I've hunted out there and been on quite a few late-night drives too, but by night it becomes very creepy. I will state this now, I'm not going into the supernatural if something creepy happens to look at me. I'll look for a logical explanation. If you tell me a haunting story, I'll roll my eyes, but there is no explanation for this one. So one evening, some friends from the city call me. They want to go to this cemetery and they want me to take them out there. I agree, So they make their way down to me, and we all go around 8 p.m. This is in mid-fall, so it's somewhat dark at this time. We stand around having a few smokes and catching up with one another, and there are 5 of us, and around 9 p.m. we leave. Part of this trip is on a paved highway, but the rest is on limestone, gravel roads, and about 6, maybe 10 miles at most to the graveyard. We took my friend's new car at the time. It was a few months old and was a reddish-maroon Pontiac G6. If you've ever drove on a limestone gravel road, you'll know that your car will get covered in a fine white dust. We make it to the cemetery. The entrance is a large cast-iron gate. So we go in, and I show them the headstone. It's a very large one from the early 20th century, and it has a very creepy saying on it. Something like, "Where you are now, I once was, and soon you will be where I am." Since reading it, I found out it's a pretty common thing on old headstones. My friends are in agreement. Yeah, that's really creepy. They ask if anything has ever happened to me out here. No, not really. My car once overheated by driving it, but that's about it. Now, this gravestone sets in the last rows facing west, and to the south, maybe 50 yards, are a whole row of children's small graves, just big enough to fit names on the stones that were quite small too. Well, urban legend says if you run between those graves, zigzagging through them, you will die. My friend starts trash-talking, telling me that's the dumbest thing he's ever heard of. He yells he's not afraid of any stupid dead babies. I said, "I don't know, man. I always heard that whenever someone did it, they were dead a week later." He tells me I'm an idiot. He starts running through them and gets halfway and says he could care less about the supposed curse, but he doesn't complete the whole run and comes walking back. We joked with him and asked him if he's too scared to do it, and he says, "Yeah, I got creeped out halfway through." We went back to the entrance, had a few smokes, shot the breeze a minute, and I was ready to leave. I hadn't had dinner, and I was getting hungry. It was around 11 p.m, and we headed back to the town I live in. On the south side of town, there's a McDonald's. I pull in and we head in to have dinner. When we leave the car, it was under a street light, and the car was well lit. When we get to it, a friend noticed there were small handprints all over the car, no fewer than 20. They were the size of a 2-year-old's, but not all were the same size, but all were very small. They were on top of the trunk, on top of the roof. You could see them because they were outlined in the dust from the gravel road. I remember looking really close, and you could see fingerprints in the white dust, highlighting every crease, and it's the weirdest thing I'd ever seen. There's no explanation. If they were there before we went out, they would have been covered by the dust. We couldn't figure out how a kid could have gotten on top of this car. There were no kids around where the owner of the car lived, nothing. We tried to come up with a reasonable explanation as to how they would have been there, but nothing made sense. I told my friend that ran through the graves he better watch out. To this day, if you bring it up with him, he won't hear a word of it and will leave the room or get angry that you brought it up with him. And we're close to 20 years since that happened. This happened in Sydney, Australia, around 2016. I was 14 years old, and there was an abandoned house in the corner of my suburban street. It wasn't like your 100-year-old house that was decaying. It was fairly modern and had been abandoned fairly recently. Old lady passed away, I think. Me and 2 of my friends, Jackson and Harley, used to walk past it on our way home from school, and on one occasion, being the naughty teens that we are, we thought we'd jump the fence and check out the house. We managed to make our way into the house through a side window that was broken, and I remember that Harley found a screwdriver and removed the lock to the back door so that we could get out that way. Whoever lived in this house had obviously been a hoarder. It was your classic newspapers and letters stacked up in the living room sort of deal. We searched through a bunch of the rooms, and Jackson and I snagged some old jewelry that we found. There was also a basement to the house that was a bit dusty and had a bunch of old kids' toys and stuff like that in it. We didn't go down there much as it smelt pretty bad and was just kind of gross in general. It became a regular thing from there on that we would enter the house after school and just hang out, look around at all the old stuff. It was never overly creepy or anything, but it did have just an off feeling about it. There were picture frames of people I never knew on the walls, and seeing these random people just sort of smiling out at you always made me feel a bit uneasy, especially since we were technically infiltrating this home. There were a few occasions when I would be walking home from school alone, because my friend had other activities or I was coming back late, and I would never work up the courage to enter the house alone, but would often stare up at the kitchen window from the side path, half expecting to see some ghostly figure staring back down at me. Anyway, one day Jason and his family had gone over to Harley's for a barbecue. Their parents were good friends, I believe, and they messaged me on Instagram around 8 p.m. asking if I wanted to go back to the abandoned house. I only lived about 2 streets away from them, so said sure, and I went out to meet them. We met up out the front and made our way into the house through the usual back door. I was a bit nervous because we had never been into this house at night before, but we had our flashlights on our phones, and it seemed less scary with all 3 of us just laughing and joking around. We entered the house and began our usual routine of looking around for anything cool. We were joking and making light of the situation, searching through some old letters and boxes for anything worth taking home, or at least taking a picture of. At some point I start recording on my phone. I can't remember why exactly. We were all hanging out in the kitchen area, and Harley is mid-joke, when all of a sudden, we hear multiple rapid knocks from the floorboards directly below us. Without sparing each other so much as a glance, we bolt out of the kitchen and through the back door. The back door was on a balcony and staircase, but I was in such a panic to get out of the house, I jumped off the balcony and landed on my ass, but didn't care at the time. We scrambled over each other trying to get back to the main road, and once we did, we went straight home. The next day we talked about it at school. It all seemed hilarious now that it was the daytime, and we laughed about how I had jumped off the balcony and bruised my ass. But we did never go back to the house, despite still walking past it on the way home from school. I still had the video on my phone that I had recorded, and you can hear the knocks in the video. I'm curious if the house is still around 7 years later now. My father was a handsome, young 20-something, living in a half-sketchy, half-artsy area in Westport with my mother. They were newlyweds expecting their first child, my older brother, within a month. This was the mid-1980s. At the time, my father was into the whole Robert Smith kind of look, dark long hair and piercings, and kind of had a sensitive feminine look going on. He had been mistaken as a gay before because of his look. Not to stereotype my own people, but you know what I mean here. This is important in a bit. My parents had been shopping around Westport on a street full of little boutique-style shops. My mother stepped into a shop to look around, and my father waited outside smoking a cigarette. He said a man came out of an adjacent store and struck up a conversation with him. The man was polite and friendly, but as the conversation continued, he became increasingly personal with his line of questions. Where do you live? Do you want to come over, etc.? My father was young and dumb, and too trusting, having grown up in a small Kansas town and being newly transplanted to this large city. But still, this man began to strike my dad as odd. Just as it was getting weird, my mother came out the store, came up behind my father and looped her arm through his. Like I said, my mother was heavily pregnant at this point, and as soon as the man saw my mother do that, he stopped what he was saying mid-sentence, turned around, and walked back into the adjacent store without another word. They both thought it was odd, but frankly my dad was glad to be away from the man. They continued shopping and went home. That man ended up being the Kansas City Butcher, or Robert Berdella, an active serial killer in the Kansas City/Westport area. His MO was to lure gay men into his home, sexually assault them, torture them, and then finish the job. He was caught only a few weeks after his encounter with my father when a victim escaped his home, fleeing down the street in only a dog collar. My father highly suspects that Bob Burdella was scoping him out as a potential victim, and upon seeing my pregnant mother, realized he wasn't gay. Oh, and the shop he came out of? That was his shop, Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, an oddity shop that displayed the skull of one of his victims in the window. My story takes place 19 years ago. I'm a female and was 16 at the time at 5'7". I was about 130 pounds and like to think that I'm strong, but I couldn't take on two young men. It begins with my mother and stepfather going away on vacation and leaving my 17-year-old sister and I home alone. They did this quite often. My parents were not winning any parenting awards. My sister and I didn't get along either. She was a nasty piece of work. Luckily, she decided to go stay at a friend's house while my parents were away. I was nervous about being alone, so I had my boyfriend stay with me. He was a pugnacious dickhead, but I'm glad he was there. One night, Brett and I were at my house, and we had just started messing around when I hear a really loud knock at the door. My room was in the basement, but at the landing area between the stairs. You know how some staircases are broken up? There are turnaround areas, that's the landing. There was a window that I could see the stairs that led up to the alcove of our front porch. I could see two people standing there, and just as I was peeking out to see them better, one of them saw me. I remember feeling the breath sucked out of my chest. There were two young men standing on my porch, and I had no idea who the hell they were. The guy that saw me let his friend know, and they both looked in the window and asked me to come to the door. My boyfriend had gone upstairs to open the door, and I remember freaking out because I told him not to. He was one of those guys that thought he was Mr. Tough Guy and believed he could fight anyone. He was telling the guys to leave just as I joined him at the door. They saw me and called me by name and asked for me and to let them come inside. Brett told them to piss off. One guy, I think his name was Wes or Les or something like that, insisted we come out and that they wanted to talk to my boyfriend. I said no thanks, we're going to bed, and shut the door. I was really confused and getting very frightened. They stood at my doorstep for a few minutes and then began knocking again. They explained to me through the door that he was my sister's friend, and that she told him I was home alone and they should come by. I knew my sister and believed them. That did not, however, make me feel stupid, and I told them to leave. They started kicking the door. I was shaking and I seriously feared that it wouldn't hold up. I was so scared that I ran into my kitchen to call the police. I was assured that they would be there soon and to lock the doors and stay on the phone. Meanwhile, Brett was still yelling at them, which only served to piss these guys off more. I begged him to shut up, but he wouldn't listen. I was locking all the doors and windows upstairs while Brett went down to check the doors. Down in the basement there was a huge mudroom area, and it had a thick wooden door made of 2x4 planks, kind of like a barn door. The door had a big old lock on it, some spring-loaded turnbolt, and also had a plank to set across it like a barricade. One of the guys was pounding on the door, and Brett heard him tell the other to try and go to the back door. This stupid door was one of those 1960s things that had a happy little square window right at face level with a little curtain across it. I was at this door trying to jam a chair underneath the flimsy knob when I looked up and saw the unnamed guy just looking in at me, and the dispatcher asked if I was okay. I barely squeaked out that one of the guys was looking right at me through the window. He was older than me, probably 20, and he was tall and looked scary as hell. His dark eyes were drilling into me, and he wore this creepy, placid smile on his face. I had never seen this man before, but he knew my name. He tapped on the window with one finger, never breaking eye contact, and said, "Becky, let me in." I couldn't breathe. The knob was rattling as he was messing with it, and he said again, "Let me in, Becky. I just want to see if you're okay. I just want to talk." He stared at me. I didn't say a thing. I was just 3 feet from him with my back pressed to the fridge. Then he started beating on the door and screaming, shouting to let him in, and that if he had to break in the door, he'd kill us both just to open the door. He looked maniacal. There was a loud knock at the front door, and the man went silent. He gave me the most hateful sneer I'd ever seen. I heard shouting and he ran down the back stairs and into the woods along the back of my yard. Brett had gone to the door. It was the cops. There were 2 female officers at the front door, and Mom was just starting to raise her voice to ask where I was and to come to the door too. I was so relieved, I began sobbing. I told them they had run away through the woods. Luckily, the woods were not deep. They actually ran along the bank of a large river, and there was a barricade just up from where the woods met the road. One officer ran around the back while one stayed to get a description and take my statement. Officer 1 came back and spoke to Officer 2. She said she saw them running through the bridge. They both left in a hurry, hopped in the cruiser and sped off. I was still crying and shaking, but absolutely furious with Brett for riling them up. I went to make myself some tea, thinking of all the ways I could kill my sister when she got home. I had so much anger, fear, and adrenaline pumping through me I could have ripped her to shreds in that moment. 20 minutes later, the cruiser came back. There were the 2 guys sitting in the back seat, and the officers wanted me to confirm if it was the right guys. I looked through the window and saw them. They still looked terrifying to me. They were in cuffs and couldn't get to me, but I would not approach them. Neither would look at me. I confirmed it was them, and we spoke a bit, and I told the cops about my sister, suggesting that these 2 men should come and see me. Officer 2 mumbled, "What a cow." I had to agree. I pressed charges for attempted forcible entry, property damage as they had broken a window in the living room, trespassing, disorderly conduct, and attempted assault. Initially they both pled not guilty, but later admitted to some of the charges. They both got 18 months in jail and were forbidden from contacting me or my boyfriend ever again, and to be at least 500 meters from me at all times. I never heard from them again, and I confronted my sister about it, and of course, she denied it, then laughed about it, laughed at me. She was an awful person. I have no idea what their true intentions were, as they maintained they were just there to talk to me. I'm thankful I didn't have to find out. When I was a baby, my parents said that I would always see things they couldn't, and would often laugh or even talk to nothing. So I've always been superstitious, but didn't necessarily believe in ghosts. When I was 9, we moved into a beautifully maintained 1950s home, with original bathrooms and other original features. The previous owner who built the house also died in there, presumably of old age. My room was the original primary suite, and always uncomfortably colder than the rest of the house, even in the Texas summer heat. Like if I set the thermostat to 76, it really felt like 68. My parents chalked it up to the house being old, and my room being the most shaded by a giant oak tree in the backyard. Within weeks of moving in, I began to hear human footsteps on the roof, but only ever over my room. There was no attic above my room, so it couldn't have been squatters. My parents tried to say that perhaps it was just animals, but the gait and weight of the steps felt undeniably human. Whenever I tried to record these footsteps, the recordings would never capture the sound. It started freaking my parents out a bit, so they had a contractor come and look at the roof over my room and found nothing. Next, I started hearing footsteps in the hallway by my door. I was a very light sleeper and would wake up in the middle of the night to footsteps right next to my bed, only to find nothing and no one there. I would wake up to the sound of the closet doors opening and closing, but find them all closed. Our alarm system had motion detectors in the hallway and in my room, but they'd never pick up on any movement when I'd hear the footsteps. Then I began seeing a man's face whenever I would turn out the light on my nightstand. It was like an image when it's burned into your brain and looking at a light for too long, but it was a clear image of a face. When I was 10, and this had been happening for around a year, I started looking up more about ghosts and read that they can become attached to sentimental things. Because the bathroom attached to my room was original, except for flowers that my mum had painted for me, it had this razor deposit in the wall for men to dispose of their razors after shaving. All I could think about were all the razors that sit in the wall. I thought perhaps it could be something a ghost would attach itself to. So I wrote down a note promising that I'd take care of the house and there was nothing for it to worry about. I put the note in the razor hole and didn't hear any more footsteps or doors or see any more faces for 12 years. After I graduated from college, my parents sold the house. The last night I visited and stayed there before they moved, I heard the footsteps again on the roof. I feel bad for whoever it is. I always felt a hint of sadness in that room and grew very empathetic to the ghost, even with all the weird stuff going on when I was a kid. They were very clearly attached to their home, and the new owners completely remodeled it. A number of years back, I used to work in an office that was right near a cemetery. I didn't get along well with my co-workers and would often buy lunch downstairs and eat it on one of the benches in the cemetery, as it was quiet, peaceful, and I was generally not disturbed. After finishing my sandwich one day, I'm just having the last few sips of my coffee and staring at something on my phone, when I hear a baby crying. At first, I pay no notice. Surely a parent with a baby walking through the cemetery is nothing to cause alarm. But the baby just keeps on crying. Those lungs keep on giving, and after about a minute or two, I decide to turn around to see what's going on, as no one has made any attempt to appease this baby. I slowly turn around and see a baby on top of a grave plot. This really freaked me out. A baby crying on a grave plot. I look around, but there's no one to be seen. I get up slowly to have a better look around and start making my way towards the baby to see where the parent is, but I don't see anyone. I'm really starting to feel uncomfortable. I heard a lot about scams in my area where people would leave a baby to cry in the middle of the road or somewhere secluded to then jump them from the bushes and rob them. I really didn't want this to be me, and in a moment of panic, decided the best thing to do would be to call the police. I kept looking around the bushes and trees as the baby kept on wailing. I locked eyes with the baby and started punching in 999 on my phone. When I hit dial, it immediately was answered by an operator. I started telling her that there was a baby crying in the cemetery, and she asked my location. When I shared it, she told me someone would be there soon. I waited, not wanting the baby to go anywhere. I could still hear it crying. When I got off the phone, I looked at the baby and kept looking around the trees and bushes. I was contenting myself that maybe, just maybe, I was overreacting, and for who knows what reason this baby had been abandoned in the graveyard, maybe for someone to find. So I told myself that if no one was here within a few minutes, it would have to be me who goes and picks it up. I started walking towards this baby when a rustling from behind me made me jump, but it was just a squirrel. The moment I turn around, the baby and the noise are gone. I just about cracked a brick. There is no conceivable way a crying child could have been there one moment and then not the next. I swear my body flooded with adrenaline, and I'm ashamed to admit that I just froze on the spot, unable to do anything, my mind whirring at a million miles a minute as to how the hell a baby was there a moment ago and not there now. What the hell was I going to say to the police? I just about found the courage to break out and started running towards my office. I made it, but it was still lunch break, so didn't go in, and just stared at the cemetery, seeing if the baby would magically reappear, which it did not. A few moments later, a police officer arrived, and as they got out of the car, I approached them and told them that it was me. I babbled, and when they asked for clarity, I explained that I saw and heard a baby. But then, the baby was gone. I was expected to get scolded, maybe even brought in for wasting their time. But something in this police officer's look told me that that wouldn't be the case. She looked at me and just kind of shook her head. I asked her what was up, and she explained that that had been the third sighting of a baby at this graveyard in the past year. Something creepy was definitely going on, but I never got more out of the police officers as they left shortly after. I never went to the cemetery to have lunch again, and never heard the crying baby as I avoided the area. But I wonder if the baby still cries out from its grave. I grew up in the middle of nowhere, literally. Cornfields and cows, with the occasional sprinkling of houses filled with people who tended to the cows and cornfields. So, as any teenager in the country would do, I spent a lot of time exploring abandoned buildings, houses, barns, restaurants, anything I could get into. I had just got a new job in a town I didn't usually go to, and of course immediately asked the locals about the scary stories in the town. I was told over and over again a story from the 80s of a woman who caught her husband cheating and came home one day and blew his brains out with a shotgun while he slept. She then went on to hang herself in a tree behind the house. According to local legend, the police has never even cleaned the crime scene. They removed the bodies, but there were too many pieces of the husband left behind on the floor and wall. Immediately I'm interested. I asked where the house was, and surprised to learn it was only minutes from where I was working. Now don't get me wrong, I felt brave, but as a young female wasn't about to explore this haunted murder house by myself. I texted some friends of mine and asked them to meet me there that night. They of course had nothing else to do, so agreed. I got off work at around 10 p.m. and met my friends in front of the house. It was a small white farmhouse, heavily overgrown with weeds and barely visible from the road. I had no idea how we were going to get in, but I knew I had to see what was inside. Me and my 3 friends, 2 guys and 1 girl, looked all around until my one guy friend found a window that wasn't locked. He was far too large to crawl through, so my smaller guy friend crawled through and unlocked the back door. We climbed through the weeds and made our way back into the house. By the light of our flashlights, we began to explore. The house seemed untouched. There were dishes in the sink and old boxes of food in the cabinets. The walls were a mixture of yellow from long-term smoking and patches of brown, which could have been mold or could have been pieces of husband, but I wasn't about to touch it to find out. My guy friends took off to the bedroom, and my girlfriend and I looked for the basement. After some searching, we found the steps to the basement. It was dark and cave-like, unfinished, with lights dangling from the ceiling that mostly hadn't been switched on in decades. The basement had 2 sections. The first one you were immediately in was a laundry/washroom. Then behind that was an open storage room. This is where things started to really turn. We walked into the storage room and were met by a giant red painted pentagram on the floor. There were shelves all over the walls, filled with what appeared to be jars of dead animal parts and blood. There were half-burned candles, upside-down crosses, and notebooks that were falling apart from years of moisture and mold in the air. Suffice to say, we were creeped out. It wasn't until we were older that I understood what I had seen, but at the time, I didn't know too much about the rituals they were most likely performing in the basement. I have no way of knowing if the husband and wife had done this, or if it had been done by a fellow trespasser, but it didn't seem to be very recent. We decided we had had enough of the creepy basement and head upstairs, only to be greeted by the loud sound of shattering glass. One of my guy friends had decided to grab a bat from his car and bust out the old TV. We both screamed at him to stop. Yes, I've definitely trespassed, but I've never vandalized. After taking a few more swings, he stops, and instead of turning around to yell at me, he starts staring out of the kitchen window behind me, his face absolutely terrified. Thinking he's messing with me, I tell him to stop being weird and that we needed to leave before the cops came and saw his mess. At this time, my friend shifts his gaze from the window and looks at me. He points back to the window and says, "What is that?" I laugh again, thinking he's trying to scare me, but he doesn't laugh. Finally, I turn around and see movement in the field behind us, slowly getting closer to the house. We all stand at the window waiting for whatever it was to come out of the field and into the open part of the backyard. A few seconds go by before we see a woman in a long grey nightgown holding a brick in her hand, running towards the back window. At this point, she was mere feet away, and we all ducked down below the window thinking she was going to throw the brick through it, and we needed to try and avoid the shards of glass. And she did. The window shattered so loud my ears started to ring, but I didn't feel any of the glass. After a few seconds, we all stood up and looked through the hole where the window once was. The woman was gone, and the glass from the shattered window was outside on the lawn. She threw the brick at the window, but the window broke out instead of in. We all shared a collective "screw this" and ran out of the house back to our cars. We spoke about it a few times, but never to anyone else, since we were convinced they wouldn't believe us. The house had been torn down now, and the lot is now an extension of the field from behind it. I don't know exactly what we saw that night, but I'm certainly glad the house no longer stands. I was almost snatched up to what I believe was a trafficking ring when I was a little girl. Let me elaborate. Back then I didn't even know what that was. I just got a creepy feeling from a man who was following me and my grandfather around the store. I don't remember much from when I was little, but this man I remember perfectly. I was a blue-eyed, platinum blonde-haired tiny girl who was even on the cover of newspapers in the area. When me and my grandpa went to this new Walmart, I just remember getting this strange feeling and looking to my left to see a man 6 aisles down hiding behind an end cap, but leaning back staring right at me. He ducked behind the end cap when I noticed him, and I turned my head back to my grandpa. But when I looked back, he was there again looking right at me, hiding every time I saw him. Everywhere we went, he was behind us. My grandpa even noticed, and I was too shy to say something. Though I should have, because he was a police officer, and thinking back, I definitely should have said something. When we were leaving the store, I could see the man trying to catch us up, but when we got to the car, he was looking around the entire parking lot. My grandpa actually drove by him, and I ducked down below the window so the man couldn't see me. I've never felt so scared like that, nor have I ever encountered anyone who looked at me like I was prey. I never understood what he was doing or why he was following me, until I turned about 19 and started learning about the trafficking rings through social media. I really don't know if that was it, or if he was just a super creep, but I know that my fight or flight kicked in for the first time, and it was something I will never forget. It was 2005, and I was 16 years old, home alone with my new pup on the 4th of July. My mum was only 16 years older than me, so she was out partying, and I didn't expect her home that night. My boyfriend was supposed to stay over, but had to unexpectedly work a double shift, and because of the nature of his job, he couldn't just leave. My house was at the end of a half-mile dirt road, with many potholes and washboard bumps. It's a private drive with sparsely spaced homes, mostly inhabited by family. In between my house and the next-door neighbor lies an empty lot. As a child, my cousins and I would explore this lot. We would find abandoned mattresses, evidence of homeless people's shelters, and paraphernalia of drug use. My cousins always found it exciting to explore this lot, but I always found it to be creepy. Back to 4th of July. I had spent the whole night in my living room watching movies with my windows open, because it was an unusually hot night, and we didn't have air conditioning. Periodically, I would get the feeling of being watched, so eventually I closed the windows and curtains. My new puppy seemed unusually restless, which only added to my unease. Every time I took my puppy out to use the restroom, he would pace and require a lot of coaxing to come back inside. Finally, at around 3 a.m., I decided it was time to try and get some sleep. I still had a gnawing feeling in my gut that something was off, but I convinced myself that I was being paranoid. I armed the house alarm to stay, which meant only the windows and door sensors would work if triggered, and not the indoor motion detector as I was inside. Again, because it was hot. Most of the windows were cracked about 2 inches. The house alarm was set up to where you could arm the alarm with the windows cracked. I think I should mention that at 16 years old, I was 4'11" and 89 pounds. I had a tough childhood, so I was street smart and had great instincts. However, I was a child and looked like a child. So there I am, curled up in bed with my new puppy at my feet. I toss and turn, begging the Sandman to lull me into sleep, to no avail. When the alarm went off, I jumped out of bed, heart racing, and felt my blood pump through my body, rushing to my heart and head. My dog barked. That was immediate chaos. The whole scenario was disorienting. Then to add to the insanity, the landline starts to ring, which I assume was the alarm company checking in. The only landline phone in the house is in my mum's room across the hallway. I decide it's best to answer the phone and tell the company I'm not sure why the alarm is sounding off. I timidly run across the dark hallway, scantily clad in just a tank top and booty shorts. Remember the feeling of being watched earlier in the night. I make it into my mum's room panting, full of adrenaline, and reach for the ringing phone. I simultaneously answer the phone and look up at the window in my mum's room, which faces the open lot. To my horror, I observe 3 pairs of glowing eyes staring back at me from the outside open window. There are 3 men standing outside my house. The screen had been pried off, and the window was now wide open, which is what triggered the alarm. It was pitch dark outside, so the intricate details and subtleties of the men were lost to the wash of grey and blacks. All I could see was the glare from their eyes. I've yet to encounter so much evil rage in that one look. I could feel that I was in danger without a word. I stood staring back at these ominous glowing eyes for what seemed like forever. I froze in horror, and my stomach felt like it fell through the floor. My horror paralysis was shattered by my German shepherd running past me and barking at the window with every one of his hairs on edge. I blinked through my horror, answered the phone and screamed, "Send the police, there's armed men coming into my house." I threw down the phone, ran down the hall towards the garage, where I hid in a dusty closet that was most likely full of spiders. I remember being faintly worried about these things, but I knew I had to remain quiet and still. I was attempting to quiet my loud, panting breaths, as to not give away my position, because at this point I had no idea if the men were actually armed. My thoughts were flying at an alarming rate. I always thought that because I was mature for my age, and had some pretty messed up experiences in my past, I would have clarity in that situation. But I was wrong. I was a shivering, chattering mess, and it took all my willpower to calm myself down. The alarm continued to wail. which put my hearing at a disadvantage. I couldn't discern if the men were in my house, or even worse, if they knew where I was hiding. I had no idea where my pup went, which only added to the misfortune. My hands were clamping, my legs were beginning to fatigue, and my mouth was dry and had a sickly taste to it. I couldn't tell you how long I felt that way, but it felt like hours. I kept wondering why the cops hadn't shown up. Then a horrifying thought crossed my mind. What if the armed company hadn't dispatched cops? Too much time had passed without an authoritative knock on the front door from the police. I began to formulate a plan to escape to my cousin's next door when the most beautiful sound chimed through my aluminium garage door. Police sirens. When the sirens got loud enough and I could faintly see the shimmers of the red and blue lights, I opened the garage door and spilled onto the chest of a cop. I startled him, but he quickly composed himself and began to take report of the most horrific moments of my young life. I exclaimed to him, "What took you guys so long?" To which he replied that the first cop got a blowout on one of his tires because of my stupid dirt roads. That's what caused the delay. I literally could have died because I live on a dirt road. The cops were never able to find the three men. They searched high and low, took fingerprints and footprints, but nothing ever came of it. To their horror, in the empty lot behind my house, on an old ragged mattress, the cops found duct tape, a knife, and zip ties. This was all collected, but again, never came to anything. My pup was found safe in the backyard. Apparently he jumped out the house after the men and most likely chased them off. I ended up staying with my boyfriend for a few weeks after that. To this day I still have PTSD from the whole experience. If I hadn't have armed the alarm that night, I would have been dead. I know that to my core. I lived in this house for about 7 years. It's in a small town in central Texas. The house is 1 story, 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, with a front and back living room and a nice-sized backyard with a palm tree, gazebo, and a shed converted into a bar. It was right across the street from a Catholic church and cemetery. After we moved out, we found out the property used to be an orphanage in the 1960s that shut down, and before that, it was a funeral home with a crematorium that the orphanage was using to dispose of bodies of the malnourished and abused children living there. We, as in me and my immediate family, were initially hired to clean up the house after the previous tenants had trashed it. By trashed, I mean nearly wrecked. The carpets when we cleaned it were a light beige color, but they started out black. There were human-sized holes in the walls, as if someone was slammed repeatedly all through the house. Dead chickens and other small animals were all over the floor, along with black candles, pentagrams on the walls and floor, and some mystery blood smeared on the back closet of the master bedroom. How we'd feel comfortable enough moving in after everything we found? Well, that's anyone's guess. When we cleaned it all up, it was a really nice place, and the rent was only $450 a month. We should have seen the signs and the red flags based off the low rent alone, but I digress. The first incident happened on the first day in that house. I had most of my stuff in already, so my parents told me to wait at the new house while they went to our old one with my siblings to gather more things. I decided to take a nap after putting a few things on the dresser. In the center of the dresser, I put a Mary candle that my mum had given me. Might be important to note that most of the satanic stuff was found in the master bedroom that had a walk-in closet, dressing room, and its own bathroom. This room became my room because everyone else was too scared to even set foot in it, including my parents. The whole 7 years we lived there, the only time anyone else but me set foot in the room was before we moved in while we were cleaning the house. My little brother got the middle room, and my younger sister got the room next to his at the end of the hall, next to the other bathroom, and my parents turned the back living room into their bedroom. After arranging my stuff on the dresser, I laid on the bed to take a nap while waiting for my family to return with more things. Not 2 minutes after I shut my eyes, the candle slid off the right side of the dresser to the floor with a thud. I was a little freaked out, but as I was by myself, I tried to rationalize it, saying it was the wind, or perhaps my dresser was crooked or slanted. I checked the dresser by pulling it away from the wall a smidge, and putting a ball in the center to see if it rolled. It didn't. When I checked all the doors and windows to make sure there wasn't a draft or something, I put the candle back in the center and laid back down. Not a minute or so after I shut my eyes, the candle slid off the left side this time, like someone was sliding it, and fell. I said nope, and ran outside and waited on the porch until my family arrived. When they questioned why I was outside, because it was summer, and Texas is hellishly hot in the summer, I replied I wanted some fresh air and sun, trying to play it off so they wouldn't think I was crazy. This next incident happened after we'd been living there a few months. I was asleep in my room with the door open because it made me feel better, and the rest of my immediate family were gathered in my sister's room down the hall, telling each other ghost stories as it was close to Halloween. My mum said something along the lines of, "You'll better stop telling each other stuff before something happens." Right after she said that, my door slammed shut and I started screaming. Side note, when I was younger, I used to sleep talk and sleepwalk a lot, especially if there were paranormal activity in the house, as this wasn't the last time we lived in a haunted house, unfortunately. My mum urged my stepdad to go check in on me, but he just said, "You go check in on her." So eventually they both came in, and they said once they opened the door, they saw me sitting up in bed with my eyes open but glassy and not focused on anything. I kept saying, "Get off me, help." They were too scared to enter the room. So, from the door, they switched on the lights and said, "Get out." At that moment, they claim a black cloud lifted off me and I fell back in bed with my eyes closed, fast asleep. And they frickin' left me there because they were too afraid and told me about it in the morning. I knew they weren't lying, because the dream I had the night before matched up with what they were saying, and they both looked kind of pale when they were telling me. The next part of this story relates to a family friend called Donnie Ray. For some background on him, he was a family friend as long as I can remember, but some would say he was a bit of an odd character. He distrusted cars with a passion, so he rode his bike everywhere, even if it was 30 miles away. He lived in an abandoned house and used a toilet seat over a bucket, since there was no actual toilet, and he set up his own irrigation system near a stream to the house so that he could have water. He was a kind soul, and we loved when he came to visit us. We mostly went to visit him, but sometimes he'd bike the 25 miles himself as a surprise visit. On this particular day, he came in the morning, and by midday, me, my mother, and Donnie Ray were chilling on the front porch while we were drinking mixed drinks, and I had my sweet tea. My mum finished her drink and asked Donnie Ray if he wanted another, as she was about to go inside to make herself another. He said sure, why not, and she went inside. Not 30 seconds later, my mum came from this side of the house with different clothes on and walked up to us. What's weird about this is to come from this side of the house, she would have had to have gone all the way to the back door and come all the way around. We said, "What are you doing? I thought you were making drinks." She said, "Don't worry about that. Can we just talk?" and proceeded to talk about death and suffering in a kind of laughing manner as if she found it enjoyable. We didn't say anything while she talked because we were still wondering how she changed her clothes so fast. Suddenly, in the middle of her talking, she said, "I gotta go," and sprinted around the side of the house. Not 30 seconds after that, my mum came back through the front door with 2 drinks in her hand and her original clothes on. We both stared at her, and she asked, "What's going on?" We told her that she had come around the house with different clothes on talking crazy. She didn't believe us and thought we were playing a practical joke of some kind. We dropped the subject and went back to chilling. After a bit, I wanted to ride my bike. My mum was pretty strict growing up, so the only place I could ride my bike was the church/cemetery parking lot across the street. I begged Donnie Ray to come with me, since none of my school friends were allowed to come over, so I wanted the company, and he was there. My mum told me no, of course, but he said it was alright, and we set off to ride the bikes around the parking lot, because that was as far as I could go. After a while he said, "Hey baby, I want to show you a little something." I said okay, let's go to the grotto first, and we biked down to the grotto behind the church. We sat on the bench there, and he asked me what the grotto was for, and I told him you could pray, I think. We sat in silence for a few minutes till he said to follow him. He led me down the cemetery part, and we stopped in front of a grave. "That's my brother right there. He died when he was a young man." I said sorry to Donnie Ray. "What was he like?" He told me and began to cry, and said the angels have been talking to him, and that he's waiting for him. I asked him, "What do you mean?" He said he was going to die soon. The angels have been telling him for a while now, apparently. "Are you sick?" "No, I'm not," he said. "I don't know how it's going to happen. I just know it's coming for me." We hugged and stood there in silence for a little bit. Then wordlessly we came back to the house. He spent a few more hours and then biked home. A few months after that strange day, we were about to go to sleep when my stepdad got a call. It was Donnie Ray's mother, telling us that he'd got hit by a truck driver while on his bike. They couldn't even find all his body parts, that's how badly he got hit. Everyone started crying and freaking out. Suddenly a trash can in the kitchen, where we were all at, began shaking, and we froze. My stepdad screamed, "Leave now, you're not welcome here," and it stopped. After a few minutes of us standing around miserably, we shuffled off to bed. I thought back on what Donnie Ray had told me, and I cried into my pillow all night. When I was around 9 years old, I was going to my first funeral. While I was there, I wandered off from the group and went to someone's gravestone and saw the picture of a person and flowers with a small peace offering. At the time, I didn't know it was disrespectful to take flowers from a person's gravestone, and it wasn't explained to me either. So I reached down to grab a daisy that had grown over this person's grave and pulled on the stem of the flower. I found that there was some sort of resistance in doing so pulled even stronger, and to my surprise that daisy slipped out of my hand and went into the dirt, as if someone had been pulling it from underneath. I was so confused by it that I put my hand over where the daisy had been moments ago. Needless to say, it left an impression on me, so I was never disrespectful at a cemetery again, but also it made me realize what an eerie place cemeteries can be. I went back to the group and acted as if nothing had ever happened. Looking back, I think my intentions were to give the flower to my mum, but I didn't understand the implications of what it meant to take these flowers from someone's grave. To preface, I am a 23-year-old female and was 19 to 20 at the time of meeting this girl. I was also in an unstable and codependent relationship at the time and was utterly depressed, naive, and craving a sense of validation of my thoughts and feelings that no one around me at the time was willing to give me. So subsequently, I was the perfect candidate to inflate and dote upon the literal god-complexed ego of this one girl. To begin with, I was in an acting 101 class my first semester of college, and swore to myself that I wouldn't make friends in the 2 years I was set to be there, as this was community college. I would go in, get good grades, and leave. It wasn't until the third day, a week and a half since the semester started, that this girl walked in, and you could feel the air in the room grow thin. Her presence was both alluring and yet annoying at the same time. Charisma seemed to ooze out of every pore and shine like a halo from her hair. For more context, I'm from the US, and when this girl began to speak with a British accent, everyone was confused and yet intrigued. Apparently she had only just gotten there from a trip back to England with her father. Apparently that's where she was from. That's when my first instinct rang clear. Why is it that if she has enough money to be flying back from England, what is she doing in an acting 101 class at community college? I decided my curiosity was too frivolous and kept it to myself. Until the next class, when she asked me a question. I don't remember what the question was, however I do remember my initial disgust with her demeanor. She seemed too bubbly, too poised. Something was just off. After that brief encounter, I felt that was all I'd ever hear from her. However, slowly, she would make remarks at me during the class, and eventually, I started striking conversations as well. Then one day after class, she mentions to me how expensive and annoying it is that she had to wait for an Uber every time class ends. I remember offering her a ride home as an alternative, but she would dramatically decline, saying things how her parents would get angry with her for burdening me with the task of driving her around. I understood, and felt pity for her after that. In that moment, I thought she was in a household where her parents were overbearing and slightly abusive, so I decided I would try and befriend her outside of class. She seemed nice enough. I also had this pang in my heart to help her for some reason, and that was exactly what she wanted. So over time, as we grew closer, I would offer her a ride home. I would insist and say that I'm her friend, and that friends would help each other out. She seemed to enjoy these gestures. She'd compliment me, and then go on to say how tough her life is without a license. Eventually, she agreed and I took her home. It was honestly really nice to have someone to speak about class with outside of class. Soon enough, after driving her home the past few classes, she invited me for a tea. I thought it was adorable, having afternoon tea and gossiping with a friend. She was British after all. We both eventually opened up about ourselves and spoke about things besides class. She told me she was my age, and she graduated the same year as me and took a gap year. She said throughout school she'd traveled to and from England, and I found that fascinating. She was adopted from a third world country and was brought to England and then moved to her current town when she was 6. She told me about past relationships, and I opened up about mine. She always seemed to be the same to me, like she was trying to emulate me in some way. It was so subtle, it was difficult to notice at first. If I told her about the apprehension I felt in my current relationship, she'd sympathize and tell me a story about how her ex hurt her even worse. I would always take note of the things she said, because I was not only her friend, but we seemed to share the same experiences. However, hers were always more severe than mine. In hindsight, I know why. But at the time, I just thought how unlucky this girl was, and how bad I felt for her past. Soon, it became tradition to drink tea at her house after class, but I had to be out before her mum got home, and if I were to meet her mother, it would be bad. One day her mum got home early and was surprised, yet delighted to see me. She introduced herself and I did the same. All the while my friend sat, sulked in anger. Her mother seemed delighted, and I was surprised at how welcoming she was. She offered me food and gave me some crackers to take home, and I eventually confronted my friend, asking why she would paint her mother to be that way. She said that she was just kinder to guests than her. I was confused, but I also fully understood. I have a mother who is very similar to that, so I shook it off. One day in class, we got our midterm assignments. We were to prepare a non-verbal monologue in front of the class. We each get our assigned stage direction, and are asked to prepare it in 2 weeks. One of the stage directions was a girl that comes home crying after having been sexually assaulted. Another girl in our class received this one, but was uncomfortable doing it, and rightly so. A boy in the class criticized her for not wanting to do it, and she ran out of the classroom. My friend and I followed her. The three of us opened up about our past assault and eventually calmed the classmate down. Time passed after that, and a few classes later I was walking with my friend to my car. She all of a sudden runs away from me. I follow her and I'm laughing at her. She had fallen ungracefully to the ground and was in the grass on her knees. I asked her what she was doing. She was being a weirdo. What she did was related to our conversation. She looks up at me with some kind of strange fear in her eyes and says that she saw her assaulter just on the campus. I was shaken at this point because I don't remember seeing anyone walk anywhere near us. She said he walked by and stared at her maliciously. I was very confused and said she must have imagined it, but she was adamant. I was also even more confused because she had told me that she had filed a restraining order against him. How could he be allowed on campus? If he really wanted to go to the same school, there were 2 campuses in town, in 2 different towns. So surely he could have gone to the other one. I asked all these questions and was met with little answer, obviously. She said she'd talk to her mother and handle it accordingly. It took weeks to even hear anything about it. I wanted her to bring it up, but she never did. So eventually I asked, and she gave me a story about how she went to the dean's office after class and fixed things. I remember being confused because I had driven her after all our classes, and she said that they went after I left. But that couldn't have happened because the school office closed at 5 and we would always leave at 5. Many of my questions were met with strange excuses, but I remember just letting go. This was a sore subject after all, and I didn't want to upset her any more than she already was. Weeks pass, and my friend and I become inseparable. We seem to know the ins and outs of each other. We even hosted a Friendsgiving together at her house with some of the people from our acting class. Then, the end of the semester came, and I could feel the rift between us grow. I was confused and hurting. She said she wasn't going for a degree, but was just there to take the acting class. I remember being confused. I thought she was a theatre major, like me. She said she was, but I guess she changed her mind. She told me she was going to be auditioning for one of the most prodigious acting schools in London, LAMDA, and that she was probably going to get in and never see me again. I remember feeling confused. Why didn't she tell me this sooner? Why did she even get close to me in the semester? Then I thought about how it was probably all my fault, that I pushed her to be my friend. But I felt so bad for her. It was like she was asking for a friend without telling me. Eventually, I convinced her it would be good for her to be in a class with me again the next semester, partially because I wanted to selfishly keep her close, and the other part of me, because I knew from what she told me that if she never got into LAMDA, she'd probably end her life. I feared for my friend so much that I wanted to push her to be in a class with me, because she had somehow made me think that I was helping her not take her life. So she signed up for the class and decided to audition with me for the spring musical, but she wasn't going to go with me because she auditioned alone and couldn't talk to anyone before she sang, which I guess was understandable. Soon her audition for LAMDA rolls around, and I managed to come with her and her parents for that weekend. The audition was actually in New York City. It was about an afternoon's train ride away, and her parents were kind enough to pay for my ticket. How I managed to be invited was by her telling me how scared and terrified she was to be with her parents on this trip, so I offered to come to be a buffer between her and them. I was met with polite no's, and eventually, just like all my offers, I was met with a yes. Besides, I love New York City, and when I learned I didn't have to pay, was even more excited. Now, for those of you who are this far, I want you to understand if you haven't already, it wasn't like I was begging this girl to let me do her the favor. She'd answer me in a way that made things seem like I had to insist, like if I didn't ask again, she would be hurt and it would be my fault. In other simpler words, I was being manipulated into doing things for her, but it never felt like it because I meant it. I was much more generous to friends I had just met at the time. So we arrive at Grand Central Station, and I was met by my friend and her mother. We walk to the hotel and everything seemed normal. We go to sleep and I wake up, and to be honest, all I remember about that trip was how scared I was, with this new virus going around, it being January 2020, and how surprisingly her parents seemed to be such angels. I remember going to the shops with them, and they're just talking about how my friend would like this, and how they wanted to make this for my friend, and how we should go here after my friend got out of the audition. All her parents talked about were her. I was floored. I remember her telling me to stay in the room all day to ignore her parents, but I didn't want to. I now see why. Eventually we made our way to the New York Public Library. I remember going to the top floor taking pictures of the painted ceiling, standing for about a minute, and then her parents find me and say they're going to have to go get my friend right now. She was in need of some cherry-coloured chapstick and some water. They told me to stay and that they'd meet me later and to explore the city. I said absolutely not. I wasn't walking around alone in a massive city, so I went with them. And I witnessed their panic as they tried to hurry to her audition to find water and the right chapstick in time. All the while, my friend is texting them exactly what she wants and telling them to hurry. We walked about 20 minutes to this building. 20 minutes. My parents wouldn't even come downstairs to tell me something, let alone walk that far to bring me water and a chapstick. They decided too that it would take too much time to get a cherry-coloured one, and so my friend would just have to use a plain one from her mum's purse. When we get there and meet her in the lobby, when she goes to her parents and sees they have no cherry chapstick and not the right water, she's furious. She gets mad and storms into the audition room, never saying thank you. After that, we go sit in a Panera Bread and wait for 20 minutes. Eventually she gets out of her audition and meets us inside. She was adamant on alienating me from her parents and only wanting to talk to me about her audition. She tells me this story and I can't help but think she's lying about it. It just all seems so bizarre, but I don't remember the details. I just remember after the story I told her about my day with her parents and she was very upset for me spending time with them. She scolded me and asked what we had talked about over and over again for the rest of the trip. We went to sleep and left the next day. I remember feeling very weirded out with my friend after the trip. She seemed to be a lot more abrasive with me afterwards and adamant on not speaking to her parents. Eventually I learned that the name she had told me she had was not actually her legal name. Eventually I saw she had a high school diploma from 2019, not 2018, and I asked her about it, and she said that it was a misprint. The misprint turned into her graduating late because she was in the mental hospital a lot. She went to mental health programs, but also travelled back and forth to England, but also went to school 2 days a week her senior year. She said she did her senior year twice. She only lived in England when she was a child, and she actually lived in England most of her life. Nothing was adding up. All the stories she'd eventually tell never made sense when put together. I remember half-jokingly ask her to write a timeline of her life for me because things never added up. Still, despite all the inconsistencies, I still kept her as a friend. The lies were just far apart from each other to feel like maybe I was the one in the wrong. The cognitive dissonance was growing in my mind though, and this was just the beginning. Now, before I met my friend, I had begun practicing the Wiccan religion. I was a solitary Wiccan who lived by the reed, and you harm no one, do what you will. I was actively practicing altruism as a form of devotion to the Wiccan moon goddess and horned god. My friend, coincidentally, was also a practicing Wiccan. We had done full moon rituals together, and she seemed to know a lot more than I did, so I usually followed her lead when it came to these. They started out tame, making a candle manifestation wish outside, sitting under the moonlight meditating together. We'd make our wishes out loud, thus getting to know each other's deepest desires. We were very emotionally vulnerable in these moments together, and after our rituals we'd try all kind of divinations and other spell practices in our own little coven. One full moon, just before I had to leave, I asked my friend to do a tarot reading for me on my love life. I had just recently had a fight with my then boyfriend and wanted to know what she saw. My friend seemed to have all the answers about my life when it came to divination, and I was trusting of hers enough to hear her out. She started pulling cards and reading the descriptions. Every single card she pulled was a bad one. It said we'd end in failure, hardship, despair, and that I had to leave him ASAP. I remember wanting to, but I didn't know how. I left that night crying over how horrible the card reading went. To jump back in the timeline, after we started our second semester, I remember opening up to some other classmates that my friend and I were witches. I did it in a way to offer spells for help, but my friend was mad at me for outing us. She never wanted them knowing what we did, and I was confused. I wanted to help others and invite them into our little world that I loved so much, but my friend seemed to see it differently. So I respected her boundaries and never brought it up again. Eventually, as I know all of you have guessed, the pandemic started in March of 2020. Classes were moved to online, and so was our friendship. We would FaceTime almost every day and watch movies while on call. Now at my college, the musical was cast before lockdown, and unfortunately I didn't get in, but my friend did. She met all the other theatre majors and started talking to them in their Discord chat during the pandemic. I was never brought into that circle until the summer of 2020. And during that time, even before lockdown, my friend would try to date the boys in the department and even get an obsession with two of them. She had told the first one, who I am now actually dating, that she was friends with his favourite Broadway star and that she'd have them meet. He never believed her. After he turned her down, she became angry and started a rumour that he was actually gay. After that, she moved on to another guy who had a girlfriend at the time. She was even more obsessed with him. She'd enjoyed the chase, the fact that he was her friend, and stayed up late and spoke to her all night and made her happy. He had opened up to me and said she was never the only one he spoke to, and that he was a night owl because of his job, and she'd just be the only one up for him to talk to. During the course of the 2 months during lockdown, and when people began to feel a bit more comfortable, my friend and I had talked about maybe moving into my house. Now, I have a large room in my parents' basement, and my friend was beginning to scare me with her talks of her parents are awful to her when she's home and just with them. I also have yet to mention that she had an older brother with a form of autism along with other issues, and she'd talk about how mean he was to her. She's constantly calling me saying she was going to take her life. I was terrified and decided to open up my home to her. This was the worst but best mistake I ever made. Worse because of the escalation of our friendship getting worse, but best because it really made me realize how much of an awful, manipulative person she truly was. She moved in and everything was great. It was nice to be with someone who I considered my best friend. It was like a never-ending sleepover. I had a spare bed in my room at the time, and she used it for a while until she brought her mattress in, and eventually moved almost all of her things in. Everything she had, however, reeked and smelt like BO, and when she lived there she never showered. She'd stay here 5 days a week and 2 at her house, and she refused to use our shower and never changed her clothes. She'd just sit on one side of my room and rot for days, only getting up to use the bathroom and pick up DoorDash. She'd eat on my side of the room and leave her mess for me to pick up. Eventually I brought a large trash barrel for us to use, and she'd fill it in almost daily. I'd try and do moon rituals with her, but she'd refuse to practice with me. I'd asked to do tarot readings and she'd refused too. However, the prophecies didn't stop. They got worse. Instead of tarot readings, I'd get dream recalls. She'd tell me these amazing dreams she'd had. They were said to be prophetic dreams brought onto her by the goddess Aphrodite, who she claimed to work with and worship while I was outside doing my moon rituals. She'd tell me that I would become a famous actress and I'd date K-pop stars. I'd see the world and be an amazing celebrity. Obviously, I didn't believe her at first, but she'd tell her stories in such a way that it gave me hope. Hope that my hard work would actually pay off. She had the guidance of Aphrodite on her side delivering these messages. I wanted to believe her badly that I shoved all logic aside to cling to the future reality she was feeding me. I was no longer in a sad and crumbling relationship. I would be cast in shows. I'd be happy one day. And that was what I truly wanted. Soon during the summer, my friend would have another friend over. We'd all hang out, but this new girl was much more my friend's friend than mine. Eventually, however, they began to actively try to keep us from seeing each other. But it never really worked because eventually me and this other girl became close. We would even work out together in my room while my friend skulked in the corner, eyes closed, listening to music and ignoring us every time we invited her to join us. Also around this time, my friend had the boy she was obsessed over. Now, this is not my story to tell despite the anonymity. I just don't feel comfortable sharing the exact details of this boy's encounter with my friend. But what happened was later told to me by this boy, and it was on a night I was out at my then boyfriend's house. This incident happened in my bedroom, however, and its detail still haunts me to this day. Though rest assured nothing too horrible escalated, but if it wasn't for some sort of intervening that I can't remember the details of, I don't know what my friend truly would have done to him. I remember after that night, despite not knowing what had happened, my friend had grown even more malicious towards me. She began to sow the seeds of fear of the Greek gods in me, saying they were angry with me, and that's why I was having bad days. That was why my boyfriend and I were always fighting. I was doing things wrong, and it was driving me wild that I didn't know what it was exactly. All I knew was that I was upsetting the powers above me by just existing, and that my life was currently a mess. So one night, a desperate and hollow night, I asked my friend again about my future and what I was doing wrong. She looks at me and said, "Do you want it from me or Aphrodite?" I looked at her and said, "Aphrodite." My friend enters a meditative state and then looks at me in an evil, sadistic way. Her demeanor had changed entirely. I had never seen it like that. I was told the reason I was having such horrible days was because I had to break up with my boyfriend. I had to do it soon or nothing in my life would come true. No fame, nor success, nor happiness. If I didn't do it by the next full moon, my life would become stagnant, that I would amount to nothing. It was so convincing I could still feel the primal fear I felt right there and then. My friend took the bracelet I had been wearing that was from my boyfriend off me and held it. She told me still, through the persona of Aphrodite, that I was being held down by this bracelet, and that in order to rid myself of my boyfriend once and for all, I had to get rid of it soon. I was tasked to toss it in a lake about an hour from me, and to do it only with my friend. But I had to break up with my boyfriend first before ridding myself of the cursed bracelet. I was stunned. I didn't know what to feel. My friend left the so-called trance and never recalled a thing. I told her about the encounter, how scared I was, the fear of being smited, of disobeying an ancient deity. She told me that I never had to do it. I think it was just because she was scared of what she had done to me. Perhaps she thought she'd gone too far, or maybe it was just part of the act to get me to do what she wanted. I'm not entirely sure. But I was adamant on leaving my boyfriend. I had worked up the courage and did it a few days later, but everything still felt off. A few days after that, we drove with another friend to the lake. I invited that friend because I was scared to go with just my manipulative friend. I remember her being angry with me for inviting this other girl, but I didn't care. I knew something was off, and there needed to be more people, and I'm so glad of it because I'm not sure what would have happened to me. We were entirely off the grid when we got there. The GPS stopped working 15 minutes before arriving at the lake, and we got lost trying to leave. It was a truly surreal experience, and me and that other friend never felt fully safe that entire trip, and my evil friend was too calm. After that, my friend moved out of my house. We got into a fight. It was a night where she got mad at me for missing my ex. She wanted me to cuddle her, and I wasn't comfortable with it, so she went to sleep on her side of the room and sulked, waiting for me to beg her to come back, but I never did. We just went to sleep. The next day, I went to speak with my ex about our breakup, finalize things, give things back, and I came home to my friend pretending to sleep while she was laying in the dark smiling. I told her to cut the shit and talk to me. I explained where I was, and she said she knew that my mum had told her, which was actually true. We talked about how she's not getting better and how she was cutting herself again and not eating. She was just lying around all day. She made excuses when I tried helping her change her habits. I was worried, but every time I voiced my concerns, I was met with excuses and blaming for being concerned. So a few days later, she called me and told me that she'd never change and that I'd have to live with her the way she was. At the time, she adopted being diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and claimed to have always had it. I didn't believe her because she only started saying she had it after having watched a Netflix K-drama about a woman with the same diagnosis. I was finally starting to piece together everything she told me, all the lies. I also found out a little before our fight that she was actually a year younger than me, after having seen her ID. She explained that the reason for that was because her parents changed her birthday after she was adopted because they wanted a younger baby. She accused her parents of committing forgery. I wanted to take action, but she never did, because it was a lie. Her chosen name was also a lie. She told me so many stories for the reason why she went by a different name after I found out her given name. Her accent was fake. She'd never even lived in England. I believe she made that up after the trip she went on right before classes. I finally saw everything was a lie. When she moved out, she left all her things at my house, so my sister and I packed up her stuff and brought it to hers. She told me she wasn't home and couldn't help us, that she had to go get adult diapers for her dying grandma, who was always dying apparently. She also said I wasn't allowed to bring her things inside and to leave it all in her mudroom. After we had packed everything in the mudroom, my friend walks out her backyard dressed in the fanciest outfit I've yet seen her in and gets into the car with the boy she's obsessed with, completely ignoring me and my sister. Never even said thank you. I was furious. I housed this girl, cooked her meals if she even ate, listened to her, did everything in my power to care for her, and all I got was a massive screw you, and my life was in shambles. I tried confronting her on her lie, and was met with countless inconsistencies and self-depreciative excuses. So I just gave up and never spoke to her again. She blocked me on everything after that and never spoke to anyone from my college either. She's gone from social media as well. All her accounts were either changed or deactivated. To conclude, I eventually got back together with that boyfriend and recently broke up with him on my own terms. I wasn't ready to let that go. I still practice witchcraft, just not Wicca, and am much more educated now than I was 3 years ago. Like I said, I have a new boyfriend now, and I'm also best friends with the other girl who my evil friend introduced me to. I have an associate's degree in theatre arts, and I've done a lot of work in 1 year for my local theatre community. I plan to move to NYC this summer. My life is amazing now that the toxic friend, among others, are out my life. I still at times blame myself for being so trusting and naive. All the hurt I caused and how everything happened. I'm much more guarded now, but also a lot more headstrong. I also haven't made a new friend since, but I'm okay with that. There are many more lies that she told, but I eventually figured all of it was lies. But it would just be too long to write, and honestly I don't remember the timeline too clearly. Thank you for hearing this though, and to my old friend, I hope to never see you again, for as long as I live. I live in the UK, and relatively near where I live is an old mental asylum. It's been abandoned and run down for quite a good few years now, and is patrolled by an old guy with a big dog, who apparently is the caretaker or owns the land, although he's usually only there during the day, and at night goes home. The asylum was featured on an episode of Most Haunted a good few years back, which makes the place ripe for attention from the locals in the twilight hours, once the patrolling dude is gone. I'd only been a few times prior to this. It was usually relatively busy, but usually infested with thrill-seeking teenagers and a few potheads looking for a quiet place to get stoned without hassle from the local authorities. Occasionally, you would get a few groups of troublemakers trying to start fights, but if you're in a group, you were usually okay. I think in 2018, me and a group of friends and my girlfriend decided to go there on Halloween night for some ghost hunting. We ended up going way later than intended, so it was actually 2 AM on November 1st when we got there, but hey, no biggie. We dodged the crowds. There were 5 of us, myself, my girlfriend Kesha, my friend Adam, and his girlfriend Merape, and his other friend Dustin. There's a small section of tree line you need to follow to get to the entrance, so we start heading through that, when we saw a bunch of guys walking over. Dustin starts stressing, thinking it's the police, because it technically was trespassing, but me and Adam start reassuring him it's fine. One of the dudes starts shouting something like, "Security, stay where you are." He doesn't sound like he's local to here, but that doesn't really mean anything necessarily. However, Adam, who comes here a lot, as he lives a 3-minute walk away, just replies with, "I don't have security here, good try mate." And the dude laughs and just goes. We all laughed, no big deal there. We go around exploring, but Kesha tells me that after we went past, those 3 guys turned off their flashlights. This place is insanely dark, so that's odd in itself, and she feels as though we're being followed. I tell the others and Dustin freaked out. Adam and Merape assure us it's all fine. Another thing I should note is these guys weren't your average people you would see in this place. They appeared to be in their mid to late 40s, all quite big and broad, and not your usual hangout spot, being an asylum at 2 a.m. As we're going around, we hear something landing behind us. We looked, trying to work out what it was, but couldn't see anything. A few more things start landing. Stones were being thrown in our direction from somewhere. We couldn't see where. They kind of figured they were coming from one of the nearby windows and started shouting up at the window a few expletives at whoever was throwing them. They stayed quiet, just occasionally throwing more. After Adam and Kesha both got hit by a stone, we all determined it was time to leave and began to go. Dustin and Kesha basically wanted to run off, but Adam convinced us that they're likely just trying to scare us, so to not run or panic. So we casually walked off, shouting a few expletives, and more stones got hurled our way. We managed to get around the rest of the asylum without much hassle, and had a gander around. We were heading back towards the car via a different route across a field, near the edge, where there was another window. I told the guys that I thought I saw some people coming out of the little door at the bottom. Adam shined his torch over, and sure enough it was the same 3 guys as earlier. No torches on, just seemingly coming from the route we had just taken, almost as if they had been following us. Just to elaborate, as we were entering initially, they were heading towards one of the exits, so it seemed as though they were leaving when we arrived, and then we put 2 and 2 together and concluded that they were the ones likely lobbing stones at us as the projectiles came from a window to the building that we had just been in. We walked back along the field. The dudes followed but slowly, not as if they were trying to catch us or anything. By the time we got to our car, they were out of sight. I don't think these dudes intended to harm us, other than an occasional donk by a stone, likely just trying to frighten us. Either way, me and Merape both felt very on edge. Kesha and Dustin were panicking and stressing the whole way around. Those 2 were terrified. Adam seemed quite calm about the whole thing, if not a bit annoyed. But it was definitely something that creeped me out, and something that kept us talking for the night. Like, why the hell were they following us? And what were their intentions? Just a little game to have fun at our expense? Or something a bit more sinister that they might have not been able to achieve? What are your thoughts on this? I was living in the Fiji Islands back in 2016. I was 14 years old. This story happened to my family, but mainly my mum. It was on the 31st of October, and I was at my school for a Halloween-based party, and my parents and my little sister were going to a family friend's Halloween party, so the house was empty. My party finished at 9 p.m, and my dad came to pick me up, but dropped off my mum and sister at the house because our security alarm was ringing. Because no one was home, my family obviously called the security company over, and they sent a van with 3 guards. My mum opened the house and let everyone in to check the whole house, and they see no one. My mother checks all the cupboards and under the bed with my little sister, who's only 12. The security go outside in the garden and in the basement to check if there's anyone, and it's not an accidental ring, but we don't have any pets. My mum turns on all the lights from the living room to the balcony. She starts to open the window and the gates that protect all the windows to get to the balcony. But when she looks at the keyhole, she notices flip-flops on the floor. She then looks closer and sees 2 pairs of legs hiding really close together near the wall under a garden sofa. My mum yells out of her lungs, that they're on the balcony. The two guys got scared and jumped off the balcony into the garden. One of the guards grabs the guy, but the second intruder jumps on the guard and they run away, jumping over the fence and into the forest. My mother regrets yelling that if she'd come down and spoken to the security guards quietly, they probably would have been caught. My mother was crying, holding my sister to hide her, and telling her that everything would be all right. The security then called the police, and they did a report and described the guys. The cops were there in minutes. The guys who jumped lost a hat, their flip-flops, and their socks to use as gloves, as well as 2 knives. Also, some of the thieves stole stuff from our garden. Sadly, the guys were never found again. But 2 weeks later, my mum pulls out of the driveway and looks in the rear mirror of the car, and is 90% sure she sees the 2 guys opposite our house staring at her. The short one had the same new hat, and the other guy had brand new flip-flops. When my mum drove away to the police station, the guys were gone, never to be seen again. I got home after with my dad and mum and found my sister crying. My dad was mad that he didn't stay, but my mum had drank and could not drive. Luckily, my mum saw them before she opened the window, because if she hadn't, who knows what would have happened. Now, how on earth did they get to the balcony? It's going to sound a bit silly, but right next to the balcony where they were hiding, there are 2 wooden poles linked with a weird plank. It's not to hang anything, but just there. My dad asked the landlord to get rid of it, but the landlord didn't want to. To give more about the pole thing, me at 15/16, when I was 6 foot, I could jump and climb onto my balcony because I did sneak out of the house to see my girlfriend at the time. I'm 21 now, and ever since have made sure to check every single door is locked before I do anything. These stories took place when I was young, at either my house or my grandparents' house. We only live 5 minutes away from each other in any case. My house was built on an ancient vine culture, and my grandparents' house was purchased from a previous owner, and they have no history about what was on there before. My first experiences began pretty late. Before that, I had never had any disturbing experiences except nocturnal terrors and nightmares, but nothing abnormal. Even though I grew up in a Catholic family, I had never been taught that spirits existed. To me, ghosts were just the ones you saw in cartoons, with the white drape and the 2 holes for eyes. I did not know that human souls had the possibility to stay on Earth. My mother always said, good souls went to heaven, and bad souls plummeted to hell, and I never questioned it. I wasn't even interested in it. I was a kid, and had other interests than death. My mum never really believed in the paranormal anyway, and my dad was even more skeptical. It all started when I was 9. In my house, there were 4 rooms. 3 were on the first floor, and there was a guest room on the second floor, which was basically used like an attic. The 3 downstairs bedrooms were my brother's, mine, and my parents' respectively. When my mum discovered she was pregnant again, and since I was the eldest, I had to move upstairs. It was a very big room with a personal toilet and bathroom, and to be honest, I like it a lot. But back then it wasn't the case at all. The first 2 years I couldn't sleep in the room. I always felt like there was something heavy in the atmosphere, like I was being watched. I was very cold when I would be there in the middle of summer, and the summers where I lived were very hot. Up until I was 11, I was spending my whole time downstairs in the living room or in my little sister's room, which had been my bedroom before. Then I found the courage to move back to my bedroom, but things got worse. At first, it was just noises. Every evening, as soon as my father turned off the TV to go to bed, I heard noises in the living room. The light switch went on or off. It's a specific light switch. I don't know what's the matter with this one, but it does a lot of noise when it's being used. The gamer chair of my father was wheeling, and it sounded as if someone was running barefoot on the ground, and children were running everywhere. There were other strange noises too, as if someone was using a broom and sweeping up. One evening I heard someone climbing the stairs very quickly. At first it was clear and distinct and I thought it was my brother, so I went out of the bedroom but no one was there. Then I felt as if someone was touching me while I was in bed. I felt a heavy weight on the bed, sometimes even someone's breath. Safe to say, I was terrified. I remember crying in fear when I felt hot breath on my face. A lot of items started to disappear too. Some of my clothes, some of my sister's shirts, a karaoke mic that Mum had tied to the dressing room, an entire file with papers out of our car that my mum had left in plain sight because the car was to be sold. Some shoelaces, the list goes on. My mum, who is not a real believer of these things, still confessed having experienced weird things herself. Odd noises, doors opening on their own. Once, she swore she saw my brother running outside in our garden. She opened the window to tell him it was lunchtime, and my brother said, "Yes, I'm coming." But the voice wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from his bedroom. When she looked outside again, there was no one there. We both heard strange noises coming from the rooftop as well, as if there were people running on it, heavy footsteps running around everywhere. Now she also hears noises coming from my bed at 4 a.m. when I'm sleeping. She claims she hears loud footsteps, as if you were tidying up your bedroom. Maybe I'm sleepwalking, but I don't move furniture or move things while I'm asleep. I would see that things were not at the same spot where I left them the next morning. Now, the first large event happened at my house when I was 14. It was during the Easter holidays. My brother and sister were gone for the week. I was the only one with my mum and dad. It was a sunny afternoon and my dad was working on the other side of the garden, while I was reading on the opposite side with my mum. When it was 4 p.m, I decided to go prepare myself a peanut butter sandwich, so I opened the window of the living room and walked through it. If you continued straight forward, there's a window that opens to the other side of the garden where my father was working. On the left was a door that was always open and that leads to the kitchen, so I turned left in the kitchen, and when I was almost done, I heard the window leading to the garden opening. Then I saw my mum going out, probably to talk with my dad. I didn't even pay attention. I closed the peanut butter pot and go back to my seat. It takes around 15 seconds if you walk very slowly to come back to the window where the seats are. And what do I see in the chair next to mine when I arrive? My mum reading her book. How can she be there when she was on the other side of the garden about 10 seconds ago? The only way would have been to go by the living room again, but obviously if she had to turn back, she would have been behind me, so there's no other way it could have been done. My mum had an accident a few years ago where the ligaments of her ankle got very damaged. She couldn't walk very fast at the time and still can't. When I asked her what she was doing there, she said, "What do you mean? I didn't go anywhere." And she had no reason to lie. She couldn't have moved here that fast. We did a test. It was impossible. It's also important to note that a friend of my dad's went to sleep in my bedroom when it was still a guest room, and the guy confessed to my mum that he couldn't sleep in it. It felt really bad in the room, as if someone was watching him while he was asleep. And he's definitely not the type to believe in spirits. He's a skeptical man and an engineer. I also have a dog, and it's very calm and a sweet little puppy. Never barks and feels comfortable everywhere in the house. One day I wanted to take him upstairs to keep an eye on him, since my mum wasn't home. But as soon as he entered the room I could feel he was not at ease. He kept looking around him as if he was afraid. He barked, but it wasn't an aggressive bark. It was a bark of fear. He went to my door and began scratching as if he wanted to get out. He never did anything like this. He was squealing with fear and seemed very frightened. I let him out the room. The second thing happened at my grandparents' house. There was a spare bedroom in their house that used to be my mum's bedroom. I could never stay in here. Sometimes when we were playing hide and seek, I'd hide behind an old table in that room, and each time I would feel sick, felt nauseous and cold air, even in the summer. And again, summers are hot where I live. The average temperature would be around 35 Celsius. There was this one time that I was with my friend, and we went to help clean the room because my grandma couldn't do it and she was sick, and my friend needed the money. So, it was interesting for her and my grandma too. I could tell my friend felt uneasy. She complained from a headache a few seconds after I started feeling nauseous, and each time I was feeling something, she would have violent headaches. During the cleaning session, the sponge vanished and magically reappeared in plain sight on a chair 5 minutes later. But anyway, 2 years ago, I stayed at my grandparents' house for the Christmas holidays. Problem: some of the radiators were broken, and the one in the bedroom, where I usually slept, is one of them. So I had to sleep in my mum's former bedroom. I was 17 at the time and was like, "You got this, you're not a kid anymore. It's just for 1 week." At 10 p.m. I went to the bedroom to read and chat with some friends. The ambience was really good, even though the bedroom was really cold. I finally shut down the lights to sleep, but God, that was the most terrifying moments of my life. Scratching inside the wall, strange noises, a weight on my bed. At some moments I even felt as if something wanted to lie beside me. I felt as if someone had moved the cover I was sleeping with. Then finally, after being tormented for hours, I fell asleep from exhaustion. I had the strangest dream that I was in a room that looked like a little public swimming pool, but with just one pool. There was a balcony with green plants and a little candle, and there was an old lady lying on the ground on a white mat, very pale with long white hair in a nightdress, with big blue eyes. She wasn't scary, and the overall ambience was very sweet, but still felt very strange. The woman told me to come closer with a very sweet voice and took me in her arms. She cried, telling me that she was happy to see me, but she had a cancer and that she was going to die very soon. I woke up to those words and was crying, but the bedroom was warm like in the dream. I felt extremely sad, and even now when I think about this event I feel sadness. I don't know who this woman is, and I never met her, and still have no idea. That's the long list of strange experiences that have happened to me in both houses. If anyone has any insight into what it could have been, I'd love to find out. For context, I used to live in a very small town, and this is where the story takes place. I met this girl at work when I worked at McDonald's called Lacey. We hit it off, and after some innocent flirting, she invited me over to her house to watch a movie as a date. I was only 19 at the time. I'm very nervous, as this would be the first date I'd go on as an adult. None of that kid stuff anymore. So, on the night in question, after she told me where she lived, I realized we didn't live that far from each other. As I said, small town. Now, to get to her house from mine, I'd have to walk a few streets and then the big park in the center of town, past the cemetery which was connected to the park, and a few roads over to get to her house. It was around a 20-minute walk at most, and calculating the route, told myself to leave half an hour. So at 6:30, crippled with anxiety, I left the house and started making my way as the sun was starting to set. When I was passing through the graveyard, I saw some flowers on a grave when it struck me that I hadn't bought anything to give her, not a bottle of wine, nothing. This was a mistake. So I panicked, and I looked down at the flowers. They had just been left in the plastic wrap over a grave. I didn't even hesitate. I was young, naive, and jumped the fence over to the cemetery, and grabbed the flowers, which had also still had the price on them, and made my way to her house, smug with my recent acquisition. I told myself the dead wouldn't be missing these. I gave her the flowers, and she thanked me and put them in a vase with water. Then we had a few drinks, had some food, and she made popcorn, and we sat down on her couch, about to pick a movie. As she was scrolling through the options, I sat there, nervous, because I really wanted to kiss her. We picked a movie, I don't remember which, and as we started playing, I know that my main focus was just trying to get my arm behind her head, to see if maybe I could initiate something. I had gotten the vibes that maybe that she wanted to as well, but I couldn't be sure. That point aside, I wasn't paying attention. These thoughts were just running through my head, trying to build the courage to extend my arm over to behind her neck. That's all I could think about. When, as the movie was playing, in a particularly dark scene, I see in the reflection something walk behind us. I'm a little confused. One of the first things she told me when I got there is that her mum and dad were out and wouldn't be back for 2 more days. I thought this was great, carte blanche with no parents home, but seeing that sent a chill down my spine. I asked her, "Hey, does anyone else but your parents live here with you?" "No," she replies, "just us." I decide to stay quiet, to not freak her out. But suddenly the focus of my attention was no longer that. It was now honing in on whatever the hell I had just seen. I was still gazing at the TV and thinking about my next move when something happened unexpected. The vase where I had put the flowers fell and shattered onto the ground. It made both of us jump. I physically screamed. We both got up to check it out. She paused the movie and looked at me in disbelief. "But I put them in the middle of the table." The vase, you see, was on the floor, at least a meter away from where it had been. I looked at her and she looked at me. And at that moment, deciding that this was way too spooky, I decided to tell her that I had seen something walk behind us just after I asked her that question in the reflection of the TV. She started panicking. I told her that it would be alright, and that nothing spooky was going to affect her. I don't know how I was ever going to live up to that promise, but I was feeling brave in that moment, as she was quite afraid. So the evening went that we picked up all the glass shards, put the flowers in another, smaller vase, and decided to cuddle up on the sofa. With her being scared, this meant that I could have my arm around her shoulder much easier than before. The next morning I'm walking back home, and as I'm making my way, I look over and intentionally look at the grave where I'd taken the flowers from. Something from within me panged, and I realized that maybe I had been a bit crass in taking the flowers from someone's grave. I'm unsure whether it was just coincidence, my mind playing tricks on me, or the guilt I maybe chose to oppress. But in that moment, I looked down at the grave and saw the name of the person. June Sams. She had died only a few months ago, at the tender age of 9. That somehow made everything worse. So I turned back, went to a local supermarket, got a much larger bunch of flowers and a Barbie. I put the Barbie and the flowers on the grave, said sorry, and carried on making my way home. I'm unsure if I appeased the ghost or if it was all in my mind, but I had no spookiness from there on. Neither did Lacey. We never really worked out in the end. But even so, to this day, it remains one of the creepiest things that has ever happened to me. Whether I made it happen to myself or not, I will never know by taking those flowers. But nonetheless, I have learnt to be more respectful and don't take things from the dead anymore. Me and a group of friends. Me a female, my ex-boyfriend, my female friend and the other male. We took a night of visiting abandoned places. So where I live, there are not that many, or they're protected by dogs. I don't fancy having my leg chewed off, so we all dressed in clothes that we knew we could throw away from mold and other things being in places like that, and decided to go to the furthest away one, which was an old abandoned swingers club. Just to clarify, none of us were swingers. We arrived at a petrol station halfway down from the literal mansion, walked down the other side of the motorway, and were greeted by a fence and a small brick wall. We all helped each other get over and supported each other's balance by going through the back. Backstory to this club. A few years ago, some idiots set it on fire because they thought it was funny. So upstairs was caved in, and everywhere looked like it had been mashed up. We got in and walked through the main lobby. A massive swimming pool and pretty artwork on the walls you could just about see. We looked around, took pictures, and we walked out the front, and this is where the first interaction happened. I looked up at the front, and I was the one behind everyone and was taking photos, and someone grabbed my shoulder and yanked it back, but no one was behind me, just the big gates. So I was a little freaked and asked the others if they had felt it, and they all said no. My ex-boyfriend at the time had a bat in his hand, and we walked back in. We were not going to visit the dungeon, but as we walked over there was a clown mask hanging from a rope. Bear in mind it had not been there when we came in. So I literally said, "I'm done with this, I'm out," and I began walking towards the entrance. Before we left, one of the boys had collected a teddy and put it in the car. We didn't drive for more than 5 minutes and the radio and lights went mad on the dashboard, and it didn't take long for us to jettison the teddy out the window. The second building we went to was an old pub. The back was open, so we got through there. Everything looked like it wasn't touched, and they just up and left. I took some pictures of the bar and posed as the barman and women. After we looked around, the two boys wanted to go upstairs, and we said, "Cool beans, we'll wait in the car and watch you." And we watched them, and a tall dark figure was walking around behind them. I tried to call my ex-boyfriend, but it was like trying to get through to someone on a radio. They came back downstairs, and I told them what I saw, and what they said was spine-chilling. So all the floors, a normal bedroom, right? With the mattress all stood up, and proceeds to tell me that when you get to the top floor, it's empty with a chair in the middle, a belt, and a photo of a young girl sat on the empty chair. Nothing else, just a belt and a photo of a young girl. For some reason, I agreed to go back in after that to see it for myself. I got to the stairs and everything in my body froze, and I said, "You know what, I don't want to go." Now, you know, boys being boys arguing with me over the fact that I was scared, but this was my body purely refusing to move. So they said all right and took me back to the car. As we were leaving, a pint glass went flying at one of the boys' heads and the toilet door slammed shut. And when I tell you they ran, they ran. Now, fun fact with this place, it was where the highwayman was born and raised. Turns out I'm somehow related to the guy, but it's highly paranormal in the caves up top. So was it him protecting me as a distant cousin or relative? I'll never know. I think I grew up with a family where the mum had Munchausen by proxy syndrome. Let me elaborate. When I was a baby, next door a family lived who had a baby my age. We became friends even after she moved away, as her parents had more kids and we stayed close. My parents worked a lot, and her mum was a stay-at-home mum, and typically I would go and play at her house. When I was an older child, about 9-ish, my dad was diagnosed with cancer, and my house became a tough place to live in. So on weekends/vacation time, I would spend long stretches of time with them, sometimes days at a time. They had 3 kids going on 4 at this point, all around 3 years apart. They had some type of health problem. They all had some type of health problem. They were always sick, doing hospital visits, heart issues, seizures. One kid even had epilepsy, as well as undiagnosable things that came and went. The kids would miss school. I found hidden truancy violation letters. The husband had illnesses too, but they were more severe, and I always felt like it could be the stress for caring from such a large family. The mum had some weird neurotic behaviours. She would always force me to look in her nose and throat to make sure nothing was stuck, and refused to run errands or leave the house alone. And if she thought I was awake, she would force me instead of her children to go out and do it with her, and often would leave her children for hours at a time. My mum would call to come pick me up from her house after work, and she would make sure we weren't home for hours. So it would seem like my mum didn't want to come get me, and I would have to spend the night there again. When we ate, she often made me eat different food than her kids. Not always, but often enough that they noticed and commented on it too. I was 10 to 12 and had a full eating disorder at this point, so I was generally grateful as the food she fed me was vegetable-based, and the kids would often eat junk food. I didn't think much of it until I was a bit older, and getting fascinated with the movie Sixth Sense and with the disease I thought mirrored the behaviors of this. But as I got older towards my teenage years, I became more independent, and after my father passed away, I made new friends which the mum didn't like. I recall a Facebook account made for one of her daughters, who at the time was 5, and found my new best friend, and she messaged her, in the guise of this daughter, 5-year-old's account, to ask her what we were doing together. It was at that point when my best friend told me that I disassociated with the family entirely. I told my mum and she agreed it was strange, but nothing else came of it. There were several times coming home where there would be a message in our phone that the mum was outside, or had tried to stop by, or had waited for a long amount of time for me and my mum to get home if we were out. It was frustrating for my mum too, and a bit strange. Then, when I was in high school, I had a mutual friend that actually was kicked out by his family for being gay and was adopted by the family. He wouldn't have lived with them for more than a year when he emancipated himself and became homeless over living with them. Most recently, the family has moved across the country, and it seems that the health issues still persist, but it's hard to know the degree through the internet. The kids are older now, and I don't know much about them anymore. I don't want to be disrespectful to them. I know the mum loved the kids. It was just a very odd situation when I look back on it. I was sleeping next to my husband when I was awoken in the middle of the night to the smell of cigarette smoke. Neither of us smoked. I stayed still and glanced around the dark bedroom and saw the glowing tip of a cigarette light up, and the silhouette of a man standing in our bedroom, just standing there watching us sleep, smoking his cigarette. I was spooning my husband at the time, so I whispered, "There's someone in the room with us." He jumped out of bed naked and chased this guy back through the window he came through and halfway down the block before losing him. The BTK Strangler was still active in our town at the time, and we wondered if that was possibly an encounter with him. In December of 2021, my girlfriend and our son moved into an apartment in Aberdeen. In no way is she an unbeliever of the paranormal, but she does get spooked at the idea of sharing a roof with a spirit. In the year of living in this apartment, she hadn't heard any knocking, movement, or seen any shadowy figures. Sometime after I started visiting her, we quickly found signs that we weren't alone. She would hear knocks, or what sounded like something wandering around in her home. Around the 3rd or 4th time of me coming over, we hopped into the shower after a long day of adventuring. After rinsing off and stepping out to dry, I look up into our son's room, and peering out at me was a tall, shadow figure with long arms and glowing red eyes. Within the blink of an eye, it vanished. Panic set in. I leaned into the shower and told my girlfriend what happened. Shocked and stunned, she said, "Shut up, no way, you're joking, right?" After drying off and getting dressed, I inspected our son's bedroom but couldn't find any signs of the apparition. After both of us calmed down and went to bed, we woke up the next morning to talk about what we had encountered. Fast forward a few more weeks, we started moving our son to his own little bed and plugged in our baby monitor, then climbed into the bed and cuddled up in pure darkness. As we were slowly drifting to sleep, we could hear our son start to cry. We were laying there letting him cry out a bit, then suddenly hitting us like a truck, and a deep demonic-like voice came through the baby monitor. "Wake up." Chills went up our spines and we raced into his room and scooped him up and ran back into our bed. We finally moved her out of the apartment and closer to town. When I was maybe 6 or 7, we were visiting family in New Orleans. I was sleeping in this strange room, strange bed, so I was having trouble getting to sleep. I heard a tapping on the window, softly. I looked at the window and thought I saw something move that looked like a brimmed hat. It was a split-level home, so whoever it was would have had to have been tall. I woke up my parents and they told me the house was old, with wooden floors that creak, and that I was imagining things, so to go back to bed. In the morning, we found the back gate lock had been broken. This happened to me last night. I was with my best friend walking, and we decided to go to her grandma's cemetery to light a candle for her. We were walking down the street to the cemetery, ready to enter, and she tells me that she saw something before we entered the cemetery. I told her that she was just freaking out, and we were walking towards the grave, when I heard something and decided to look. It was 9:30 p.m. My friend had taken a few steps forward and I was horrified. Near a grave was a dark figure with a very white face, and I froze. My friend noticed that I stopped, and that I was frozen, and she kept calling to me. I didn't speak or move, and after a few seconds I told her we needed to leave. She asked me what was wrong, and all I could tell her was that we needed to leave. A few moments later I told her what I saw, and she told me to leave because she had seen the same thing. That thing was watching us both leave the cemetery, and we began to run. I'm not the type to believe in the supernatural, but what I saw and what she saw left us both speechless. This story is from a friend of mine. Back in 2019, they were asked to dog sit for a co-worker for 24 hours, while their co-worker went to Atlantic City with his girlfriend. The dog was very easy to take care of, friendly, loving. The hours went by, and after watching a movie, my friend really had to use the restroom. While doing his business, he could hear the dog barking downstairs, and assumed the dog wanted to go out to take care of its business too, since he hadn't let the dog out for a few hours. After going to the living room to let the dog out, my friend noticed the dog wasn't barking at the front door to leave. It was barking at the basement door. Before my friend could investigate what the dog was barking at, the door handle turned, and 3 men in masks emerged from the door, and then ran away after the big German shepherd bit one of them in the leg. The dog, named Lucy, saved the day. I'd like to preface this by saying that I believe in spirits and ghosts. I've had many encounters in my life, and I have tales from my family too, that I retell quite often. Honestly, telling scary stories has become one of my favorite things since I was in 3rd grade. All that aside, my first time living away from my parents began in August 2020, in a cookie-cutter neighborhood that was relatively new and in a very nice area. I lived there with 3 other friends at the time in this 4-bedroom home, and between myself, my best friend and roommate, we had 2 cats, Stark and Hoshi. Hoshi is my cat. He's a funky little man, but he's a good boy nonetheless. But that doesn't omit him from any heinous deeds. In this first house, Hoshi and I got the master bedroom, which included a master bathroom and a walk-in closet. For the entire year I lived there, I never let the closet go without the lights on. I set up LEDs and would hang out in there from time to time when I was overwhelmed, and even slept in there a few times because it was just a comfortable space. But I did not like the closet to be dark. I can't explain why. There just needs to be lights there at all points. If there weren't any lights, I couldn't stand to even look there. Now, another part of the bathroom was a huge-ass bathtub that I absolutely adored. I grew up relatively poor, so I hadn't been able to take a comfortable bath in a long time, so I was very excited for this. I don't positively enjoy bathtubs, but I love to boil my skin like a lobster. So when I had a particularly bad day, it was nice to just sit and roast in the warm water. One thing in particular that I like to do on those bad days is lay back and put my head underwater, just enough for my ears to be covered so the world can be muffled for a while. Then I stayed like that for however long my brain needed to feel at peace, and then sit up and I'm good to go. I took baths pretty often at this house. It was a nice privilege compared to what I grew up with, and one day I was bathing and I dipped my head underwater. I stayed still for some time. Then I heard a quick few knocks that were muffled from the water, so I sat up. Thinking it was one of my 3 roommates, I called for them to enter my room, but that I was bathing, so not to come into the bathroom. When I received no response, I shrugged it off as perhaps one of the cats, and underwater I went again. Moments later the knocks happened again and I repeated the process. The 3rd time the knocks happened I got annoyed and texted my roommates asking who keeps messing with my door. The response was that no one was trying to get at my door. Again I assumed our cats were being brats and finished my bath. From that point, any time I dunked my head underwater I'd hear these knocks. Honestly, I'm ashamed to admit it took me a bit of time to realize, but I finally figured out that the knocks were coming from the side of the bathtub and not my bedroom. The only reason I picked up on it was because the difference in sound of the light wood of the door and the hard plastic of the bathtub. I have no idea what was knocking, and this isn't to try and say anything, but I think whatever was knocking on the side of my bathtub thought that I was going to drown, but who knows. I don't take baths at the new house. We affectionately call it the murder house, so I can't continue to test the knocking. What I will say is that I have a vague idea of what was doing it. In the house we would often see this small shadow, by we I mean 3 out of the 4 of us, that would actively leave our rooms. We would see it run down our hall, or peek around the corners, or even poke its head in our rooms. God, that sounds crazy. Anyway, whatever that shadow was, like idiots, we gave it a name. And I know that you're thinking it was a bad idea. Trust me, I understand. But the shadow never felt malicious. Instead, it felt very calm and curious. We called it Lewis. I think Lewis was knocking on the bathtub and staying in the closet most of the time, which is why my low-key medium self was always iffy about that space. Who knows the real story though? I have more, that's for sure, but that's the most that came from the cookie-cutter house since we left in August of 2021. I am a 21-year-old female. At the time of this event, I was around 17 and preparing for a camping trip. I had to load my car up, so I was cleaning it out. I was left home alone while my dad and brother were out of town on a trip. Our older sister being a town over, I never really minded being left alone. It was nice, honestly. The experience definitely left me feeling otherwise, and to this day, I cannot comfortably be left alone in that house for long periods of time. Prior to this, I would have liked to think I was a vigilant person, definitely hyper-vigilant now. I was cleaning out my car, enjoying my day and excited for the camping trip. I was finishing up in my car, my windows were down, and I hopped in and began the ignition to roll them up. As I'm doing so, I look in my rearview mirror and noticed an older man standing at the end of my driveway. Instantly, my stomach dropped. I remember thinking to myself, how long has he been there? It was obvious I was home alone. Typically, there were 3 cars plus an Airstream in the driveway. Now stood just me and my silver Honda Accord, alone. He stood there smiling, kind of. I wasn't really sure what to do. He was just looking. I hopped out of my car and just stared back at him, giving him a look like, "Are you lost? Can I help you?" A piss-off kind of look. He didn't respond. He just stood there. So I hurried into the house, stood by the door and locked my car, making sure to have the alarm go off a few times. While doing so, I was staring at him, trying to make a note of his appearance. I had never seen him in my neighborhood. He definitely looked disheveled and out of place. Maybe he wandered from the retirement home a few blocks over, but this was my home, the home I had grown up in all my life. and I felt unnerved by this man's demeanor. I live in a nice neighborhood. I never thought something like this would happen to me. Again, I actively try to be vigilant and aware of what's going on around me, but this just shows you could be doing everything right and it could still happen to you. After getting into the house, I began calling practically everyone I know, mainly family, especially ones close by, to come to the house and just ease my mind. But no one was answering. I grew panicked, as I was trying to decide what the hell to do. I watched him pick up the newspaper from his feet and head towards my front door. I cracked a brick and hurried into my brother's room to spy from his window, still trying to contact someone. He began knocking, then banging, and ringing the bell. He watched me go in. He knew I was here alone. My dad's house is practically falling apart. If he wanted to, he could have easily gotten in somehow, especially if he managed to get into my backyard and try to enter from there. I thought if I didn't answer, he'd just give up. I was unfortunately wrong. He proceeded back down the driveway to my car, peering in each window, circling it. Then he made his way towards the sides of my house, looking in windows, heading towards the back gate. In retrospect, definitely should have called the cops. I just didn't want to believe it had to escalate that far, but I definitely felt unsafe / life-threatened and terrified to the point of not moving. I sprinted to the back door to make sure it was locked, thinking I was literally screwed. Then, as if the gates to heaven had parted, I heard my dogs going crazy. Suddenly I had an aha moment. My dogs, a German Shepherd and a German Pointer mix, were barking up a storm. As I imagined, the guy was aiming to get through the back. With their presence, he hurried back out front. He again started to bang on my door. I'd gotten hold of my grandpa. He was heading over as quickly as he could. I just had to wait it out. But how the hell do I get him to leave? It clicked. I called my dogs in and whispered, "Who's here?" "Sick 'em." And they went absolutely ballistic, barking like mad at this unknown man at our doorstep. So much so he left. My grandpa came, searched, saw no one. We even drove around to look for the man, to see if he had left empty-handed. I've been through so much, but just thinking about how vulnerable and naive I was in that moment will forever haunt me. Sadly, as a young woman, I'm now bound up in other uncomfortable, threatening positions that suck. But I won't be screwed over or go down gently, nor will my dogs. I don't know what would have happened without them, and I'm thankful for my intuition. I am a 28-year-old female. The story I'm about to tell you happened back in 2016 with my best friend Chris. Now, ever since the day Chris and I met, we have always got ourselves in the dumbest things ever. Chris ran away once and had my nerves all messed up. But he came back because he had no money. We're not the smartest teens, but we still enjoyed life. One summer night, Chris and I were hanging out, and we were trying to think of a place to explore, like we always did. At the time, I told him I'd never been to the old rock house in Greenwood, South Carolina. Now, before I get started, let me give you a bit of history on the rock house. A man named Thomas "Tom" Paine Tolbert built a fireproof house back in 1926. After years of family homes burning down, Tolbert lived in the detached kitchen and used the large house to store family heirlooms. Tolbert lived his later years in isolation. The now crumbling fortress is accessible only by foot, and no one has ever lived inside its walls. You can look up way more of the history online if you want. Back to my story. I'd always been told the rock house has many spirits in and around it, but like I said at the time, I'd never been there. So with that, Chris and I took my cousin's car and headed out to the old rock house. I've heard of people going in the daytime, but never heard people say they went at night. We, being dumb, went at night because why not? Ghosts and spirits never bothered me too much, being that I've seen them my whole life. Once we pull up to the woods and park on this side of the road, I get the bad feeling run all over my body. I sat there for a moment. I believe Chris sees this look on my face and asks if I still want to do this. Something is telling me not to get out, but at the same time, I want to see this place even at night. Yeah, let's go see how scary this place is, I told him. Yeah, let's do it, he replied. We get out and start walking through the woods. As we're walking, we have our phones out for light, and we're making jokes and acting silly as we always do. We can never really take anything seriously no matter what. And as we're walking, we don't realize how quiet it is to be in the woods at night, in the middle of summer. We find our way to the front of the house. Chris is in front of me, and we are looking at the house. No front door or windows. All you can see is pure darkness. For some reason, I just can't move, even though Chris is walking to what used to be the door. At this moment I realize we are just in complete darkness with no sound, no animals, no bugs or wind. Just the silence. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I see something moving on the top left window. But before I completely look, I hear something to the left of me and look over but see nothing. A feeling of dread falls over me. Chris is now at the door of the house and looks inside. I look at the window and there it is. Something is there looking down at me. My body turns cold. Those eyes. I'll never forget those eyes burning a hole through my soul. Bright, yellow-reddish eyes like fire. All of a sudden I hear Chris say, "Ah, hell no." He turns to run to me, but my body is still frozen. He grabs my wrist and pulls me to run. He never lets me go. As we are running, we are jumping over falling trees and the debris from many travelers to the rock house in the past. As we run, I realize something is running beside us, but I dare not look back. My body is now in pilot mode, and Chris has the grip on my wrist still pulling me. My mind blank, heart racing, and at one point I feel like I can feel the breath of whatever's chasing us. The moment we make it to the car, everything comes back to me, and I'm back in control of my mind and body. We jump in the car, and Chris goes to start it. He had his face covered in the steering wheel as he tries to start the car, but it's dead. We start freaking out, my head buried between my legs, and Chris still hiding his face. "This is it, Chris. This is how we die, because of dumb stuff like this." Chris yelled at me to shut up, that we're not going to die and the car will start. I can feel this thing outside the car. Just there. Is this why there are so many spirits here? Does it take the souls of the people it's caught? I feel it looking at us. Something wants me to look at it, but at the same time a voice in my head is telling me not to. I want to cry. The car starts, and Chris tries to speed off. We started going down the road, but then one of the tires blew. We are now on the side of the road again, and we just sit there not wanting to get out. It's quiet again. The feeling of being watched is still there. Luckily for us, a guy in a truck pulls up behind us. I feel safe right now. The guy pulls over and helps Chris arrange the tire. I hold my phone with a light, with my back to the woods. I still have that feeling. I want to turn and see what's there, but I dare not. Something is telling me to stay put. After the tire gets fixed, we head to the huddle house nearby to calm down. The poor lady working that night sees something wrong, and with what little money we have, the lady helps us pay for the meal. The next few days, strange things start happening around my house. For example, I'm in the kitchen fixing something for lunch. My roommate and I are talking like normal, and the cutting board goes flying across the kitchen. She gives me this look and says, "See what you caused? Stuff keeps happening for no reason, all because you went to that haunted place." I picked up the cutting board, and at this point feel like I need to make things right. I've always been told that if you disturb the dead, you have to make things right. So with that being said, that weekend, I go to see some friends who don't live far from the rock house and tell them I need to go there, so we do. It's daylight this time. Once we get there, I still have this feeling, but I don't say a word. Once we get to the house, my friends go look around. They explore the place inside and out. I look to the left of me and see nothing, but the feeling is there. I walk in the direction that Chris saw something, and I look into the room on the left of me, and the room is full of designs and paint all over it. The whole house is covered in the same way, but there is something about one room. There's a pentagram with all the markings around it. I yell out to my friends that I think someone might have tried to summon a demon, and as soon as the words leave my mouth, something comes crashing down. I nope the hell out of there and start running out of the house, sadly leaving my friends inside but not meaning to. All I do is run through the woods yelling, "I'm sorry," and don't stop until I'm out of the woods. My friends come after me, wondering what's going on, so I tell them about the other night and what had just happened as well. At this point I wanted to leave. We all get in the car. The friend driving goes to start the car and it's dead, just like the other night, but a different car, mind you. My mind goes back to the other night. This big dark creature comes to mind for some reason. I'd never even seen it before. Was it the thing chasing us that night? I try my best not to freak out. I called my roommate to come and collect us. As we were waiting, a car pulls up. He must live on the road and know what happens, and he says that every time someone goes to the house, their car is dead when they get back. He helps jumpstart the car, and we go down the road. I see my roommate and I jump out of the car and jump into mine. I speed off as fast as I can, wanting to get away from this place as quickly as possible. My friends met me at my house and I made a promise to myself to never venture to the rock house again. For some reason, Chris and I stopped hanging out later. We didn't get into a fight or anything, we just stopped being friends, and we never spoke about what happened that night until a few weeks later. We both seemed to have forgotten that night. I called him and asked him what it was that he saw inside the house to make him do what he did. He doesn't remember what he saw. I thought I wouldn't forget, but I did until a few weeks ago. Someone told me that your brain will block out something so traumatizing you don't want to remember what happened. Maybe that's what our brains did for us. It's 2013 now, and I remembered this story recently, as a few friends at my work told me they went to visit the rock house. I told them not to, but they said that they didn't believe in ghosts and wanted to experience something ghostly. I told them to go then, but I would never be going there again, to no one's surprise. I live in a very rural town in Australia. I have a close-knit group of about 4 to 5 friends, and we hang out all the time. On this specific day, I was at my friend's house. About 2 days before this, her family came home and all the doors were wide open, yet nothing was taken. This family insist to leave their doors open, specifically in this town where crime runs rampant. On the day that I was over with Mike at Alyssa's, we were just hanging out on our phones when the front door banged open. We looked at each other but brushed it off as wind slamming on the door. In hindsight, the wind would not have been able to reach this door, as it was in a little covering. Maybe 2 minutes after, the 2 sliding back doors were slammed very loudly. We brushed it off not to scare ourselves. But then we heard loud noises inside the house and footsteps running around their noisy wooden floor. This is when alarm bells began to ring in my head. I was thinking about how someone had already been there and wondering if this was the same person/people. We jumped up, and me and Alyssa held the bedroom door closed. Alyssa suggested that we call the police. I didn't think it was a good idea, but as I'm holding the door, someone starts running and slams into her door. At this point, it was definitely time to call the cops. They pick up and try to talk to Alyssa, a little difficult because she's bawling her eyes out. Eventually, the operator understood, and within less than 2 minutes, the police are at the door. These police officers were very kind and just asked about the situation before saying, "We found the kid." I thought they meant the person that broke in, so I asked them about the kid. And the police officer looked confused and said, "The missing 5-year-old?" We had no clue there was a missing child on the loose, and the police officer said there were about 40 cars looking for this kid, and many people knocking on the doors to ask if anyone had seen her. While I think the police were kind, their reasoning for the break-in was crazy, and they said it was probably a police officer running in and looking for the kid. We all looked confused and then realized what he said and backtracked, saying that they should have announced themselves though. Pretty unsettling with police officers trying to calm us down, but after talking about it with my friends, whoever broke in probably saw Alyssa's mum leaving the house with 2 teens in the back, so thought the house was empty. Alyssa has a brother, so altogether they have 3 in the house, but on this day her brother had a friend over and they were driving somewhere else. So, to the robber, please, let's not meet. Both me and my friend like taking pictures of abandoned buildings because we're weirdos like that. Well, there's this old abandoned mental hospital from the late 1800s, early 1900s, about 5 hours away from where we live, and we decided to go there for a weekend. So the weekend comes, and since our parents are friends as well, they decide to come along. We drive halfway across Virginia and finally reach this place. We're walking around outside and decide to go check out the old graveyard where they buried all the patients, and which was in a wooded area. They also did some pretty messed up experiments on the patients as well, which I think was pretty common for mental hospitals back in the day. Anyway, we're walking along the path in the graveyard when I notice something white sticking out of the ground. My mum, a former X-ray technician, looks at it and says, "Oh, that looks like a human arm bone." And then I say something like, "Oh, that's nice." I really wasn't shocked or scared, I was just thinking, this is a graveyard, graveyards have bones in them. And the rest of the trip was really fun, except for the redneck who yelled at us for pulling over in his property for a second because we were lost. Still, it was a little bit unsettling to find that. I reside in a quaint UK town steeped in a history of battles and civil strife. At the age of 19, I embarked on a job as a waitress in a well-known restaurant nestled in the heart of the town. The restaurant was housed in a centuries-old building with a captivating legend that claimed King Charles II had sought refuge there and made a daring escape through its back door. The owner hinted that the establishment was haunted, but I, like others, casually dismissed such tales, thinking, aren't they all? The building, brimming with history, boasted an actual dungeon from bygone eras, complete with a faux skeleton, a feature I hesitated to explore. Yet it was an engaging conversation starter for patrons. My first summer working there coincided with a break from university. One sweltering day, I was upstairs restocking the minibar with an assortment of mixers and pristine glasses. Clumsily, I knocked over a bottle which triggered a curious sequence of events. I heard a cascade of sounds, like numerous bottles rolling beneath the bar, shattering one by one. Astonishingly, a wine glass materialized out of thin air and crashed into the crate holding the bottles. Anticipating a significant cleanup task, I peered under the bar, only to find nothing amiss. Oddly, the one sole bottle was on its side, the one which I had initially toppled, and it remained intact, perplexing me. On another occasion, while navigating the bustling kitchen with a stack of plates in my grip, my necklace inexplicably catapulted itself and landed at the far end of the kitchen. To my amazement, when I retrieved it, the clasp remained securely fastened. Pictures would seemingly float off the walls, much to the astonishment of both staff and patrons. Ladles would unexpectedly leap from simmering pots as the chefs prepared their culinary creations, and glasses would mysteriously glide across surfaces before our bewildered eyes. Some colleagues claimed to have seen the apparition of a Civil War soldier strolling through the upstairs bar, though I personally never bore witness to such a spectre. These inexplicable occurrences were regular features of my time at the restaurant, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously eerie and captivating. When I returned to work during the Christmas season, however, the enigmatic phenomena had ceased. Strangely, throughout it all, I never felt fear. Perhaps it was not a malevolent presence, but one thing was certain. I had never encountered anything quite like it, before or since. To give some background, we went to Independence Cemetery in Indiana, something we often do on the 4th of July, since we were all confused about plans for the night, and my partner's mum suggested we should go. I've only been there 3 or 4 times myself, and this was the first time I had been out of the car when we got there, since their mum and their dad never really let us since the energy is always off. This time their father didn't join us, and I was able to escape into the humid night to dick around freely while my partner followed me around. I taunted ghosts and whatever was listening, being the Shane to the Ryan of this time adventure. I do this often too. My partner doesn't really condone my dumbery, they find humor in it. My partner took pictures of me acting dumb, crouching and pretending to be rabid as I whistled at the arse crack of night and taunted, generally just being a nuisance and an idiot to get a good laugh out of myself and my partner to ease the mood. I left the next day heading back to my house since my parents had gotten home from Michigan and I had things to do with them that afternoon. I had finished cleaning the house and my partner messaged me, showing me a picture and asking what the hell I saw. I looked closely into the darkness and thought it looked like a corpse, though this could be the saturation being turned up slightly. We talked about it being any number of things, but my point still remained, that maybe after our tomfoolery, perhaps something wanted to make an appearance to scare us, even though it didn't get the chance. For a bit of background, I, a 17-year-old male, was with my 18-year-old girlfriend in England on a little getaway with my parents. Even though I'm 17, I definitely look younger. I'm roughly 5'4", and due to that, I get misaged by different people. I think it should be known for later in the story. Also, I wear a swimming top when I go into a swimming pool because I get anxious. So me and my girlfriend decided it would be cool for us to go for a swim in the pool within a hotel. It was nothing super big or super small, and luckily there was only one other guy doing laps of the pool. Nothing remotely strange in the slightest. This is an inside pool. I put down our towels and the key to our locker on a chain and got in. Around 5 minutes later, an older man, probably 40 to 50, entered the room in a small pink bikini. Obviously, it's a bit odd and very uncommon, however I don't really have a real issue with it, each to their own. What got weird is when he entered. Me and my girlfriend kept to ourselves, minimal eye contact with everyone else in the pool, and we didn't speak. However, the guy came over to us almost immediately to say hello. Out of kindness, we both said hi back and smiled. He would swim around the area of us and make eye contact, specifically with me repeatedly. I felt beyond uncomfortable, as I wanted a relaxing swim with my girlfriend. He continually swam in our area, until he made the comment about how he hopes I don't mind that he wears ladies' clothes as he's gay. He looked me right in the eye as he said that. I felt slightly awkward because he was in a bikini. Not that there's anything wrong with that. However, I couldn't help but notice he was looking at me very often. I was getting more and more uncomfortable. I didn't want to be a nuisance and make my girlfriend leave the pool because of it. Nothing really happened while in the pool itself. Onward from that point, we didn't move around much, pretty much hovering in one spot with me slightly nervous. He went and spoke to the other guy, who was swimming for a while, and kept peeking at me while doing so. To be honest, I think the other guy just wanted to swim and didn't really care what he had to say. However, after the chat, he then got out. As the guy got out of the pool and went and laid down on the chair next to the one we had our towels on, I didn't know if he'd specifically chosen that one so that he could look at us, but I could have excused it as a coincidence. Once my girlfriend walked away and I was grabbing my towel, He decided to ask in a specific tone about why I wear my swimming top. This gave me incredible vibes of him flirting in a way, asking me why I didn't take my shirt off when I swam. I was stumped, and I just said, because sunburn, even though we were in an indoor pool. I also said I felt comfortable, because I realized we were in an inside area and probably looked beyond stupid. He smiled and said, okay. He then looked at me and said, I think you'd look better without one. This made my heart race a little and I was ready to go. I was shocked he even had the guts to say that to me, so I laughed it off and said bye. I personally am of the belief that he thought I was younger than I looked, and maybe that's why he kept eyeing me up. It's pretty sickening. In any case, at least when I left, I didn't have to see him anymore. I wonder what you guys think. Was I misreading a perfectly ordinary situation, or do you think there was something there? Yesterday, I was on my way back home with truck parts that I had picked up and did what I do a lot of the time. I opened up my map on my iPhone and started checking the countryside roads for any cemeteries I wasn't aware of. I go to them and walk through and record audio and video for my own record. I located one on a narrow side road and went to the area. When I got there, I discovered that it was on private property and would be a 10-minute walk through the field to get to it. Not wanting to upset the property owner or get in trouble for trespassing, I went to a house that was next door, back a long gravel lane. As I got closer to the house, it was obvious that it was not being lived in. It was a huge 2-story farmhouse that in its day must have been quite beautiful, I'm sure. I decided to go ahead and knock the door, as I've seen people live in worse conditions and wanted to make at least an effort to knock on the door. Not gonna lie though, this place was unkempt and had a pretty creepy appearance with tattered curtains on the windows. A few windows had been broken. I opened the screen door and knocked on the door. It swung open when I knocked, exposing the house that appeared to have been quickly moved out of years ago, full of furniture, clothing laying on the floor. The kitchen was visible down the hall from the front door, and I could see the table was still there. I decided to step into the threshold of the doorway and began recording with my iPhone, yelling out, "Hello?" several times, knowing that there was no one there. Within about 45 seconds of stepping in, I was hit full on the front of my body with an air so cold that it was like stepping outside in the winter night with just shorts on. It was very cold air. Now the outside temperature was about 60 degrees and had been warm for several days. The house was not cold when I stepped in, but this cold air that hit me started to slowly move up my lower legs. Now, as this took place, my lower left leg, just above the ankle, began to feel as if I was being ate up by fire ants, but there were no ants. I asked out loud, "If you're doing this to me, please stop because it hurts." And after asking several times and explaining that I was not there to do anything to the house or property, the burning sensation stopped, but the very cold air remained. I made my intentions very clear and never moved further into the house. I asked the usual questions and panned to my left and right, capturing each room off to the side and the staircase that was directly in front of me. Just as I stated that I was going to leave and would maybe come back someday, I observed with the naked eye a misty apparition cross in front of me from left to right, which I also captured on my phone. I was by myself, I wasn't smoking, and there was no fog or mist outside to come inside. The feeling that accompanied this was dark, ominous, and unwelcoming. I've been to many cemeteries and other places over the years, and have never witnessed anything like this. I'm somewhat skeptical and always try to debunk anything that I get, but this one has me speechless, and I will definitely be trying to locate the owner in an attempt to see if I can get permission to investigate further one day. My roommate and I recently moved into a new apartment. Almost immediately, we began to experience a series of unsettling events. These strange occurrences included mysterious tapping on our closet and windows, the occasional sound of footsteps when no one was around, and an unshakable feeling of being under constant observation. Even our ceiling fan seemed to have a mind of its own, spinning faster and generating a louder hum for no apparent reason. Additionally, both of us caught fleeting glimpses of undefinable figures in the corner of our eyes. At first, we tried to rationalize these bizarre incidences as mere quirks of the new place, possibly just the house settling or producing normal everyday noises. However, our skepticism took a hit during a casual evening chat when the tapping returned. I decided to make a whimsical attempt at communication, suggesting a code where 1 tap meant yes and 2 meant no. When I inquired about the presence of someone or something with a series of questions, we received a single tap as a response. Following this eerie incident, our anxiety levels reached a new height, and we couldn't help but entertain the disconcerting idea that our apartment might indeed be haunted. To rule out wiring issues, we thoroughly inspected them, and we also have multiple fire detectors and a carbon monoxide detector as well. Now, one thing is that our apartment occupies the top floor with only an attic space above us. We explored the possibility of any abandoned upper-level apartments, but it remains an enigma. In addition to the previously mentioned events, other strange things happened on the first few days we were there, like the doorknob mysteriously jingling. I could try and explain that away as a potential break-in, but my room constantly feels colder than the rest of the apartment, and objects will occasionally move on their own. The unsettling events escalated after an ill-fated attempt to interact with whatever might be present. The closet housing the attic entrance would inexplicably open by itself. The back porch entrance would also swing open, even in my roommate's presence. The shower curtain would be drawn back on its own, and during a shower, I felt an eerie touch. My roommate had an unsettling experience too, with something he described as an ice-cold hand tracing a circle on his back. However, most disturbingly, our confrontation with the unknown took a more sinister turn when my roommate was with his friend in the house, when suddenly he felt as though he was being strangled by an invisible force. Candles would flicker in the rooms devoid of any draft, and a door that wasn't locked seemed to be held shut by an invisible presence. There was also the whispering that we would both hear that only added to the sense of unease in our apartment. And I ask this of you: do you think our house could be haunted? This is going to sound ridiculous, and I know you may not believe it, but I'm out in the boonies in Canada. This happened when I was making meatballs at 3 a.m, and my kitchen has a door with glass on it leading to the porch. First, the doorknob turned, and I blamed the cats. Then, someone started kicking the door. I think that they were checking if we were home or had dogs, because they didn't kick the glass, only the door. So I woke up my fiancé and he grabbed a hunting knife, and I armed myself with a meatball and turned the light on. We ended up buying the door motion sensor alarms for that back door that chime when the door is opened, as well as some lights for the porch that are motion activated. The spooky part is when I woke up at 2:30 a.m. and had the sudden urge to make my great-grandmother's meatball recipe. I'm not sure if we would have had known about the attempt, or if they'd have tried harder if I wasn't on the other side of the door to react. We both believed my granny was watching from wherever souls go, and wanted me to be alert and not scared. Also, because this happened mid-prep, I was filled with adrenaline. I woke him up and just walked around the house and onto the porch with a raw, half-rolled meatball hanging out of my hand. If the person had broken through, maybe I'd have thrown it at them? Who knows? But it was a comfort for me. And while I would not like it to happen again, it feels good to know that either spidey senses or lost loved ones have my back. They didn't come back, but in that same week, when we let our neighbors know, We found a car had been stolen nearby, and another house had been broken into. Our neighbor, who also had a dog, said that her dog was upset a few days later, but whoever it was didn't attempt to go into their house. My whole life, my mother has told me snippets from her childhood. From what I've learned from her, my father, and eavesdropping on family conversations, my mother had a terrible childhood. My grandfather was an abusive junkie who left her home alone for days at a time. It wasn't until she was 17 she was able to escape. In her mid-20s, she met my father and they got married. They tried for years to have children, but had been told they would never be able to. Then on March 26, 2001, my grandmother had an overdose in what is now my parents' bedroom. We don't know if it was accidental or purposeful, but they believe it was an accident. The next day, the 27th, was the date put on her death certificate. Exactly 1 year later, my parents had their first child, me. Growing up, I didn't know anything about my grandmother besides her name. That is until one day I was in the 4th grade, going through our home library. I come across a book and am instantly drawn to it. The book is a law book. I liked books so much that I took it to school the next day to read. That is when I decided I wanted to become a lawyer, and I plan on starting college next year to pursue that dream. The reason I'm telling you this is because I would find out later that the book had belonged to my grandmother, and at one point in time she herself had been in law school but never graduated. There's always been small coincidences such as these that have made me feel connected to her, as if she was still here now. This is where things begin to get weird. For as long as I can remember, I hear things at night in the attic and walls. The obvious answer would be animals, but I've heard animal sounds in the attic before. Scratching, scampering, squeaking, but that's not what I hear. It's thuds, heavy things being moved about. High heels was very common when I was younger. My sister and I have bedrooms on one side of the house and my parents on the other. For years, my sister and I have been complaining about these noises, but my parents have never been able to find anything or hear anything themselves. Everything I've told you so far is interesting, but I didn't consider it enough to share. But things have been getting weirder lately, and I've become genuinely concerned. Personally, I've always believed in spirits, and that there may be one in this house, but I never had anything besides noises and feelings to back it up. That is until a few weeks ago. I was having a bad day. So bad, in fact, I was sitting on my bed sobbing. This may seem dramatic, but I felt the need to open my arms wide and release my emotions. And that was the first time it happened. I heard something, and I looked up. The cords on my fan were swinging back and forth rapidly. My fan wasn't on, and my arms weren't long enough to reach the cords. I even tried to stretch and touch them from where I was sitting, but I was at least 2 to 3 feet away from even being close. Now to the reason I'm sharing this. About half hour ago, I'm sitting on my bed watching a show when I heard a noise. I look up, and only one of the cords was moving, and fast. My fan wasn't on. I put my hands around the cords to feel if maybe air had done that, although it doesn't explain how only one would be moving without the others being affected. I'm honestly very freaked out, and would appreciate any thoughts and suggestions. I live in Ottawa, Ontario, and work for myself as a residential HVAC installer. One winter in the late 2000s, I had a job in the downtown area, reconfiguring some ductwork in a very large 3-story house that was undergoing a full renovation. I estimate the job to be about a day's work and schedule accordingly. The day of that job, however, I overslept and showed up late in the morning. The contractor who hired me greeted me with a sarcastic "good afternoon," in reference to my late arrival. The house had pretty much been gutted down to the studs, and there were several tradesmen working in various parts of the house. My work was on the second floor, so I made a few trips to bring all my tools from the van and got to work. As is often the case, the work turned out to be more involved than I had expected, so I knew I had to work fast or I was going to be there all night. I became very focused on my work, and after a while noticed the lights go out, as one of the work crews, maybe the plumbers, were leaving. They said something about there only being one extension cord I could use for power, as there were no outlets anywhere. I absent-mindedly thanked them but stayed focused on the work, relying on the natural light spilling in through the windows. At some point later on I noticed the natural light was getting dim, so I started thinking I would need to get out my trouble light soon. A little while after that I noticed it seemed to be a little quiet, so I stopped working and looked around. I couldn't see anyone or hear any voices, but I had the distinct feeling that there was still someone around. The time had come to plug in my trouble light, so I went over to where the extension cord was and plugged in. Then I listened for noises downstairs but heard nothing. I checked the time on my phone and it was after 5 p.m. I walked up to a window at the front of the house and looked down at the big laneway, which seemed very far down from this towering house. Aside from my van, it was empty. Being wintertime, it was now pretty much dark out. It was one of those dreary, cloudy winter evenings. Wind was blowing a light dusting of snow in the front of the streetlights. There wasn't anyone to be seen on the street. In that moment of realization that I was alone in the house, that feeling I had of someone being around instantly intensified into a very strong feeling that someone was definitely on the second floor, watching me through the bare studded walls. The hair stood up on the back of my neck and arms, and I turned around and saw no one. I had one trouble light lighting the floor with all my tools spread all over the place. I had about an hour and a half left of work to do, and I often work by myself in empty houses and in the evenings, and I'm a large guy that doesn't scare easily. The bottom line was, despite that feeling of being watched, I had to put on my big boy pants, so to speak, to get the job done. I've never put ductwork together faster in my life. I just tried to block out my emotions and work. As I worked, and as the night got darker around me, that presence intensified. It definitely felt malevolent, and after a while it seemed to be coming from every direction, especially the stairs leading to the third floor. It seemed quite angry that I was here. I was afraid to focus my attention on anything around me for fear of actually seeing or hearing something to go with that presence. To have to finish my work and clean up my tools under that angry, oppressive presence was horrible. By the time I packed up, then started bringing my tools downstairs, it almost felt like it was chasing me out of the house. The last thing I had to do, and the hardest, was to make that last trip back up to get my final load of tools. Before I pulled out of the parking lot, I looked up at the house and it seemed to be glaring at me. I've had paranormal encounters before, and I couldn't discern whether this was just demonic in nature or a very angry ghost. I remember thinking as I drove away, God help whomever was moving into that house, and in future, I should try to avoid sleeping late.